barbershop paradox. Imagine a barber in a small town. The barber is a simple man, but with one peculiar rule that everyone in the town abides by. He shaves only those men who do not shave themselves. That's it, a straightforward rule. But now, consider this. Does the barber shave himself? On the surface, it sounds like a harmless, even mundane question, doesn't it? But upon closer inspection, the paradox begins to unravel, revealing a deep and mysterious problem at the heart of logic itself. If the barber does shave himself, then by the rule he cannot, because he only shaves those who don't shave themselves. But if he doesn't shave himself, then by the same rule he must shave himself, because he only shaves those who don't shave themselves. The more we try to solve this simple problem, the more tangled it becomes. This isn't just a whimsical riddle, it's a puzzle that digs into the core of self-requisite, logical consistency, and even the foundations of mathematics and philosophy. So who shaves the barber? And does the very act of asking this question bring us closer to a deeper understanding of how logic works, or doesn't work? Let's dive into this paradox and unravel the profound implications it holds. The barbershop paradox, though framed in a humorous and everyday setting, is actually a simplified version of a much deeper and more serious philosophical problem that Bertrand Russell encountered in the early 20th century. The paradox is closely related to Russell's paradox, a fundamental problem that emerged in set theory, the branch of mathematical logic that deals with the concept of sets, collections of objects. Russell's paradox revealed a contradiction within naive set theory, which had been widely used by mathematicians. The paradox emerged when one considered the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Does this set contain itself? If it does, then it must not contain itself, because it only contains sets that don't contain themselves. But if it doesn't contain itself, then it must contain itself because it contains all sets that don't contain themselves. This created a logical loop, a paradox that could not be resolved within the framework of set theory as it was understood at the time. In his quest to resolve these contradictions, Russell introduced his famous paradox in 1901. The barbershop paradox is a version of this problem, where a rule about who shaves whom leads to a contradiction when applied to the barber himself. The paradox is often presented in a simplified form because it is more accessible to non-specialists and provides a clear example of how self-referential rules can break down when taken to their logical extremes. The barbershop paradox is an essential tool in understanding the limitations of formal logic and the dangers of self-reference. It shows how even something as seemingly straightforward as a barber's rule about shaving can become an unresolvable problem, a dilemma that challenges our basic assumptions about truth and logic. At first glance, the barbershop paradox seems simple. A barber shaves all men in the village who do not shave themselves. On the surface, this rule seems perfectly clear. The barber's job is straightforward. He only shaves those who do not shave themselves. The logical structure is seemingly unambiguous. If a man does not shave himself, the barber will shave him. If a man does shave himself, the barber will not. However, when we try to apply this rule to the barber himself, a paradox arises. If the barber shaves himself, then according to the rule, he must not shave himself, because the rule only allows him to shave those who do not shave themselves. But if the barber does not shave himself, then by the same rule, he must shave himself, because the barber shaves all those who do not shave themselves. This creates an irreconcilable contradiction. The barber both must and must not shave himself. This paradox isn't just a trivial riddle, it challenges the very foundation of logical systems, particularly those that involve self-referential statements. To understand the depth of the problem, we need to explore the concept of self-recreation. A self-referential statement is one that refers to itself. The classic example of this is the sentence, "This sentence is false." If the sentence is true, then it must be false, because it says so. But if it's false, then it must be true. This creates a logical loop where the sentence cannot be either true or false. The barbershop paradox is a variation of this kind of self-referential problem. To dig deeper into the paradox, let's break it down step by step. The barber's rule is that he shaves all those men who do not shave themselves. This rule is clearly meant to apply to other men in the village, but we now need to consider the barber himself. If the barber is one of the men in the village, then the rule should apply to him as well. But here's where the trouble begins. If we assume the barber shaves himself, then he must violate the rule, because he is supposed to shave only those who do not shave themselves. But if we assume the barber does not shave himself, then, according to the rule, he must shave himself, because he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. This creates a paradox, a circular problem with no resolution. Russell's paradox, which deals with the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, is the mathematical equivalent of the barbershop paradox. In set theory, a set is defined as a collection of objects that satisfy a specific rule. But when we try to define the set of all sets that do not contain themselves, we run into a problem. If the set contains itself, then it must not contain itself, because it only contains sets that do not contain themselves. But if the set does not contain itself, then it must contain itself, because it contains all sets that do not contain themselves. This creates a logical loop, much like the one we encounter in the barbershop paradox. The barbershop paradox is a practical example of how formal systems can break down when they are confronted with self-referential statements. It shows that certain rules, when applied to themselves, can lead to contradictions that cannot be resolved within the system. This has profound implications for the foundations of mathematics and logic. It suggests that formal systems must be carefully constructed to avoid self-referential contradictions. The paradox also illustrates the limits of self-referencing and the challenges that arise when we try to define things in a way that refers to themselves. One possible resolution to the paradox comes from a formal logical system called type theory, which was developed by Russell himself in an attempt to resolve the issues raised by his paradox. In type theory, objects are classified into different types, and self-referential definitions are avoided by ensuring that an object cannot refer to itself. In this system, the barber would not be allowed to be both a member of the group of men who shave themselves and the group of men who do not shave themselves. By categorizing the barber's shaving rule as belonging to a different type than the other men's shaving rules, we can avoid the contradiction. Another resolution to the paradox comes from the idea of hierarchical systems. In this view, the barber's role is seen as existing in a separate category from the men he shaves. The paradox arises when we attempt to apply the same rule to both the barber and the men he shaves, as if they belong to the same category. By recognizing that the barber is a special case, we might be able to resolve the paradox by distinguishing between different levels or categories of the system. However, even with these possible resolutions, the barbershop paradox remains a potent reminder of the limitations of logical systems. It shows us that even seemingly simple rules can lead to paradoxes when self-referential definitions are involved. It also raises deeper questions about the nature of truth, logic, and consistency. If our systems of logic can break down in the face of self-representation, what does that say about our understanding of truth itself? The barbershop paradox also invites us to reflect on the nature of language and meaning. Just as the paradox exposes the flaws in our logical systems, it also highlights the inherent difficulties in defining and understanding meaning in language. Words and definitions are often self-referential, and we must be cautious when we create systems that depend on such definitions. The paradox challenges us to consider the limits of language and the ways in which our words and rules can lead us into contradictions. In conclusion, the barbershop paradox is a fascinating and perplexing puzzle that invites us to question the very foundations of logic and reasoning. It forces us to confront the limitations of formal systems and to consider the ways in which self-referential can lead to paradoxical contradictions. Whether in mathematics, philosophy, or everyday life, the paradox serves as a reminder that logic is not always as straightforward as it seems. It encourages us to think deeply about the systems of thought we rely on, and to be aware of their inherent flaws and contradictions. Tortoise and Achilles. Imagine a race between two of the greatest minds in all of philosophy. Achilles, the fastest runner, and the tortoise, who, despite being much slower, has a head start. Achilles, of course, is confident he'll win. But what if I told you that, despite his speed, Achilles would never catch up to the tortoise? This paradox, proposed by Lewis Carroll, presents a mind-bending twist on the idea of motion and time, one that seems simple, yet defies our basic intuitions. Achilles begins his sprint, and in the time it takes him to reach the tortoise's starting point, the tortoise has moved just a little bit further. By the time Achilles reaches that new position, the tortoise has again moved forward, and so on. On the surface, this appears like a trivial trick of logic, but as the paradox unfolds, it raises profound questions about infinity, the nature of motion, and the very fabric of time itself. How can Achilles ever hope to catch up to the tortoise if, every time he reaches where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved just a bit further ahead. This paradox challenges the very way we understand time and space. So, can Achilles ever catch the tortoise? Let's step into the world of paradoxes and find out. The paradox of Achilles and the tortoise is a famous puzzle introduced by the Victorian writer and mathematician Lewis Carroll in his 1895 work, What the Tortoise Said to Achilles. Carroll, best known for his works Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, had a deep interest in logic, mathematics, and the philosophical implications of reasoning. His paradox is a playful, yet deeply philosophical critique of the then prevailing notions of time, motion, and infinity in mathematics. The paradox originates from Zeno of Elea, an ancient Greek philosopher who is renowned for his work on the philosophy of paradoxes, particularly in relation to motion and the infinite. Zeno posed several paradoxes that questioned the nature of motion, one of which was the Achilles and the tortoise paradox. Zeno's original paradox revolved around the idea that a faster runner, Achilles, could never overtake a slower one, the tortoise, if the slower runner had a head start. According to Zeno, Achilles would first have to reach the point where the tortoise started, but by the time he did, the tortoise would have moved further ahead. This process would continue ad infinitum, meaning that, according to Zeno's reasoning, Achilles could never surpass the tortoise. Carroll's version of the paradox takes this ancient idea and frames it in a dialogue between two characters, Achilles, who accepts the paradox, and the tortoise, who argues that Achilles will never catch up. Through their conversation, Carroll exposes the paradox's deeper implications for understanding time, motion, and infinity. The Achilles and the tortoise paradox presents a challenge to our intuitions about motion and time. It starts with a seemingly simple setup. Achilles, the swift and mighty Greek hero, is racing a slow-moving tortoise. Despite the vast difference in their speeds, the tortoise is given a head start. Achilles is confident that he will easily catch up, as anyone would expect from the fastest man in ancient Greece. However, the paradox arises when we consider the infinite number of steps Achilles must take before reaching the tortoise. To understand the paradox fully, we must first explore the logic behind the reasoning. At the start of the race, Achilles gives the tortoise a head start, and let's assume the tortoise starts at point A. Achilles starts at point B, some distance behind the tortoise. The key idea in the paradox is that by the time Achilles reaches point A, where the tortoise initially started, the tortoise will have moved a little bit ahead. Now, Achilles must run to the new position of the tortoise, but by the time he reaches it, the tortoise will have moved further. This process repeats itself ad infinitum. Now, this would seem absurd to anyone watching the race. Of course, Achilles will eventually catch the tortoise. He's much faster. However, according to the logic of the paradox, no matter how fast Achilles runs, there will always be an infinite number of steps for him to take before he can catch up. The paradox seems to imply that Achilles can never actually reach the tortoise, because there's always another step to complete before he can pass him. Let's break it down step by step. Achilles runs to the tortoise's first position. Achilles starts at point B and runs to where the tortoise initially started, point A. The tortoise, however, has already moved ahead slightly by the time Achilles reaches point A. This step is straightforward and doesn't involve any paradox, but it sets the stage for the next step in the argument. The tortoise moves ahead. By the time Achilles reaches the tortoise's original position, point A, the tortoise has moved a certain distance. Let's call it point C. Achilles now has to run from point A to point C, which seems like a simple task. However, when Achilles reaches point C, the tortoise has again moved ahead, albeit by a small amount. This step sets up the pattern of infinite steps, the infinite regression. Each time Achilles reaches the position where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved a small distance further. The key idea here is that each new distance Achilles has to cover is smaller than the last, but it never quite disappears. This process continues infinitely. No matter how fast Achilles runs, there's always a smaller and smaller segment of the race for him to complete. This is the crux of the paradox, the infinite sequence of steps Achilles must take before he can catch the tortoise. While each individual step is smaller than the last, the total number of steps never reaches zero. Thus, from the paradoxical perspective, Achilles can never catch up, because there's always another step to take. But this seems illogical when we look at it in the real world, where it is clear that Achilles would eventually pass the tortoise. So what's going on here? The answer lies in the mathematical concept of infinity and the way we handle infinite sums. To resolve the paradox, we need to understand the idea of infinite series. In mathematics, an infinite series is a sum of infinitely many terms. The Achilles and the tortoise paradox can be understood as the sum of an infinite series, where each term represents the distance Achilles has to run to catch up with the tortoise. Let's say that Achilles runs a certain distance to catch the tortoise, and each time the distance is halved, so the series of distances looks like this. Distance 1 to the tortoise's first position, distance 2 to the tortoise's second position, distance 3 to the tortoise's third position, and so on. In terms of an infinite series, this can be represented as total distance equals d1 plus d2 plus d3 plus, where each dn is the distance Achilles must run to catch up with the tortoise. The critical realization is that this series, although infinite, converges to a finite number. The distances become smaller and smaller, approaching zero. So while Achilles has to complete an infinite number of steps, the total distance he runs is finite and can be summed up. Mathematically, the infinite series has a sum that adds up to a finite distance, which means Achilles will eventually catch up to the tortoise. This brings us to the concept of convergence in mathematics. In an infinite series, if the sum of the terms approaches a finite number, we say the series converges. In the case of Achilles and the tortoise, the infinite series of steps he must take converges to a finite total distance. Thus, despite the paradoxical reasoning, Achilles will eventually catch the tortoise. Now, this resolution doesn't invalidate the paradox, but rather illuminates the difference between intuition and mathematical logic. Our everyday understanding of motion and time doesn't easily accommodate the idea of infinity. We instinctively think of time as a continuous flow, and the notion of infinite steps seems absurd. But in mathematics, we learn that infinity doesn't mean endless in the way we usually think. Instead, it refers to a process that can be broken down into smaller and smaller parts, each contributing to a finite result. Mathematical interpretation and further implications. This paradox, while seemingly trivial, offers a profound insight into how we understand the universe. It brings up important questions about time, space, and motion. Can we truly grasp the infinite through finite means? How do we reconcile our intuitive understanding of the world with the abstract world of mathematics? The resolution to the paradox demonstrates that infinite processes can be understood within the framework of mathematics, but this doesn't always match our day-to-day experiences of reality. The Achilles and the tortoise paradox is often used in discussions about Zeno's paradoxes, which challenge the coherence of motion and change. Zeno's paradoxes, including this one, were meant to show that our sense of time and motion is fundamentally flawed. They push us to consider whether motion is really continuous or if it can be divided into an infinite number of discrete steps. While the paradox has been resolved in modern mathematics, it continues to inspire thought about the nature of infinity, the limits of human intuition, and the ways in which we perceive time and space. Bureaucracy and Logic, from Joseph Heller. Imagine being trapped in a situation where no matter what you do, you are doomed to failure. You want to escape, but the rules governing the escape prevent you from doing so. This is the essence of the catch-22, a term that has become synonymous with bureaucratic absurdity and paradoxical logic. First coined in Joseph Heller's novel Catch-22, the paradox describes a no-win situation where one cannot achieve a desired outcome because the very rules that govern the situation make it impossible. In the novel, soldiers trying to escape the madness of war are told they can be discharged if they are insane. But here's the catch. If they request to be discharged for their insanity, that proves they are sane, because only a sane person would want to escape the madness of war. Thus, the very desire to escape makes them ineligible for discharge, trapping them in a perpetual cycle of logic that guarantees they can never escape. This paradox is more than just a plot device in Heller's book. It's a profound critique of bureaucratic systems and the absurdity of trying to navigate a world governed by contradictory rules. So, can you escape a catch-22? Let's dive into this paradox and explore how it reveals the complex relationship between power, logic, and human freedom. The term catch-22 was popularized by Joseph Heller in his groundbreaking 1961 novel Catch-22. The novel, set during World War II, tells the story of Captain John Yossarian, a US Army Air Force bombardier who is desperate to escape the war. The paradox arises when the soldiers are told they can be discharged from duty if they are insane. However, the catch 22, is that anyone who wants to be discharged for being insane must be considered sane, because only a sane person would want to escape the madness of war. Thus, the very desire to avoid the war proves that the soldier is not insane and cannot be discharged. This paradoxical logic traps the soldiers in an impossible situation. They cannot escape the war because the rule that would allow them to escape makes it impossible to do so. The term catch-22 quickly entered the cultural lexicon, becoming a symbol of absurd bureaucratic logic and the contradictions inherent in systems of power. The paradox describes a self-fulfilling, self-perpetuating cycle, where the solution to a problem only serves to reinforce and perpetuate the problem itself. This concept has since been applied to a wide variety of situations, particularly in bureaucratic systems, where contradictory rules and regulations create endless loops of frustration and failure. While Heller's novel focused on the absurdities of war, the catch-22 paradox has been used to critique everything from government policies to corporate culture, illustrating the inherent flaws in systems that are built on illogical or contradictory foundations. At first glance, the catch-22 paradox seems like a simple, almost comical situation. A soldier who wants to avoid the war can't, because the very fact that he wants to avoid it means he is sane and therefore ineligible for discharge. The more you think about it, the more this paradox reveals itself to be a commentary on the cruelty and absurdity of systems that are governed by rules that ultimately make no sense. To fully appreciate the depth of catch-22, we need to break down the logic of the paradox. The idea behind the paradox is that the soldiers are stuck in a situation where the rules of the system create a trap. Let's take a closer look at how this works. In Heller's novel, soldiers are told that they can be discharged from military service if they are declared insane. On the surface, this rule seems to offer a way out. If a soldier is mentally unstable and can prove it, they will be allowed to leave the war, thus escaping the dangers and horrors of combat. This seems like a reasonable policy. After all, we wouldn't want to send mentally unstable individuals into life-threatening situations. However, this rule is immediately complicated by the catch-22. The paradox arises when we consider the second part of the rule. In order to be discharged, the soldier must be insane, but if they request discharge, they are not considered insane. This creates a vicious cycle. If a soldier asks to be discharged because they cannot handle the war, it demonstrates that they are sane, as only a rational person would recognize the danger of the situation and want to escape it. As a result, the soldier cannot be discharged, because they are not truly insane. The very act of seeking to avoid the war proves their sanity and makes them illegible for the discharge that would allow them to escape. The most disturbing aspect of catch-22 is that it is a self-reinforcing paradox. The soldier's desire to escape the war is perfectly reasonable, but the system has been designed in such a way that this desire proves that they are not insane. The paradox is built on a foundation of circular logic, where the solution to the problem only serves to perpetuate the problem itself. The more the soldier tries to escape, the more they are trapped by the system. There is no way out, because the very rules that govern the system create an inescapable loop of contradiction. This cyclical nature of catch-22 is what makes it so powerful. It's not just that the soldiers are stuck in an impossible situation. It's that the system itself is designed to trap them. The paradox illustrates how bureaucratic systems, or any system of power, can create traps that are almost impossible to escape. The soldier cannot simply ask for discharge, because doing so would prove they are sane. The more they try to reason their way out, the deeper they fall into the trap. Heller's catch-22 is a critique of bureaucratic systems and the dehumanizing power of authority. The paradox is not just a logical puzzle. It is a representation of the absurdity of systems that are governed by arbitrary rules that ultimately serve to maintain the power of the system itself, rather than the well-being of the individuals within it. The catch-22 is an example of how bureaucracies operate under illogical and contradictory rules that make it impossible for individuals to find a meaningful escape. The paradox also sheds light on how bureaucracies dehumanize individuals. In the world of catch-22, soldiers are reduced to mere cogs in a machine, their individual needs and desires irrelevant in the face of an overarching system that is more concerned with maintaining its own existence than with helping the individuals it governs. The soldier's mental health, their safety, and even their lives are secondary to the smooth operation of the bureaucratic machinery. The paradox illustrates the devastating consequences of a system that treats people as interchangeable parts, rather than as human beings with their own agency and desires. The most fundamental lesson of the Catch-22 paradox is the absurdity of contradictory rules. The paradox arises from the very existence of rules that, when applied to themselves, create an inescapable situation. This is a critical problem in many bureaucratic systems, where rules are created to address specific problems, but those rules often create new problems that are just as difficult to solve. The more we try to follow the rules, the more we are trapped by them. In the case of Catch-22, the rule about insanity and discharge is inherently flawed because it assumes that individuals can be neatly categorized as either sane or insane. It ignores the complexity of human emotions and desires, particularly in extreme situations like war. By reducing mental health to a binary choice, the system fails to account for the nuances of human experience. This makes the paradox not just an abstract puzzle, but a real-world critique of how rules can fail to address the complexities of human life. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of Catch-22 is its impact on individual freedom. The paradox demonstrates how bureaucratic systems can strip individuals of their agency by subjecting them to rules that are illogical, contradictory, and impossible to navigate. The soldiers in Heller's novel are unable to escape because the rules that govern their lives create a prison of logic that keeps them trapped. Their desire to escape the war is rational and human, but the system's rules are designed to make that desire meaningless. The paradox is a profound commentary on the ways in which institutions can suppress individual freedom and perpetuate suffering by maintaining a system of contradictory and self-perpetuating rules. Drinker paradox. What if I told you that no matter how much you drink, you'll never be able to quench your thirst? The drinker paradox seems absurd at first glance, but it uncovers profound insights about the nature of contradiction and the limitations of reasoning. Imagine you are parched and in desperate need of water. You begin drinking, but as you drink, the act itself seems to prevent you from ever truly quenching your thirst. The paradox arises from the idea that if you continually drink, you may never truly satisfy your need for water. Because the more you drink, the more you must drink to continue drinking. It's a strange, self-perpetuating loop that mimics the logic of self-referencing, a logical structure where the solution to a problem actually creates the problem itself. But how can this be? Surely drinking water will satisfy your thirst, right? And yet, the drinker paradox forces us to question the assumptions behind our intuitive reasoning. Can one actually satisfy a need that is constantly recreated by the act of satisfying it? Is thirst truly something that can be quenched? Or is it an endless cycle that defies resolution? Let's explore the deeper philosophical implications behind this paradox and see where it takes us. The drinker paradox is often linked to the larger philosophical tradition of self-referential paradoxes, which challenge the way we understand cause and effect, as well as the concept of continuity. The paradox itself, although not explicitly formulated by any one philosopher, draws heavily from ancient paradoxes that question the nature of infinity, change, and recursive processes. In particular, the drinker paradox shares similarities with Zeno's paradoxes of motion and infinity, which were posed by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea around 400 BCE. Zeno's paradoxes, particularly the ones related to motion, such as the famous Achilles and the tortoise, dealt with the problem of infinite division. Zeno argued that, in order to complete a task, one would have to first complete an infinite number of smaller steps. The paradoxes raised profound questions about the nature of infinity and the continuous nature of time and space. Though the drinker paradox did not originate as part of Zeno's work, it functions in a similar manner by suggesting that an action, such as drinking, can create an ongoing need or cycle that defies resolution. The paradox highlights a misconception about how we view continuous processes, whether it's thirst, motion, or other repetitive tasks. While the process may appear to be infinite, there are limits that we can understand, and goals that can be fully achieved if we approach them from the right perspective. Ultimately, the drinker paradox asks us to consider the limits of our expectations and the ways in which we structure our understanding of processes. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable idea that many of our desires, whether they are for food, success, or happiness, may lead us into never-ending cycles that prevent us from ever feeling fully satisfied. But if we step outside the cycle, we might realize that satisfaction doesn't always come from endless striving. It might come from a shift in perspective. This is particularly relevant in the context of existential philosophy, which often grapples with the nature of human desires and the search for meaning. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus have explored the absurdity of human existence and the endless cycles of striving for meaning in a universe that seems indifferent to our desires. The drinker paradox fits within this existential framework by highlighting how even the simplest, most natural actions, like drinking to satisfy thirst, can be turned into an endless cycle, offering no true resolution, escaping the paradox. In real life, of course, drinking water does eventually quench your thirst. The paradox, like many other philosophical puzzles, is more of a thought experiment than a literal reality. It serves to illuminate how we think about processes that are self-sustaining or self-generating. In a more practical sense, one could resolve the drinker paradox by acknowledging that the feeling of thirst can be quenched without creating new thirst. Is the need for drinking ever really satisfied if the need for thirst seems to be equally unending? This idea draws heavily on concepts from infinity and recursive systems. In an infinite process, each step in the process brings you closer to a resolution, but there is always another step that must be taken. In the case of the drinker paradox, each sip of water brings you closer to quenching your thirst, but it also brings about a new layer of thirst. The paradox presents a question about how we measure the end of an action. Does an infinite series of steps ever actually reach completion, or do we simply keep going in a continuous loop? Mathematical parallels. In mathematics, the drinker paradox is related to infinite series and recursive functions. An infinite series is a sum of terms that continues indefinitely. In the case of the paradox, the term drinking becomes a recursive process that perpetuates itself. Even though each action of drinking seems to be smaller in magnitude, i.e., each sip quenching a little bit of thirst, the series never truly ends. The paradox challenges the idea that infinite processes are reducible to a finite outcome. To understand this concept mathematically, we can compare it to the classic Zeno's paradox, in which a person must first reach halfway to a destination, then halfway again, and so on. In this way, Zeno argued that one would never actually reach the destination, because there are an infinite number of halfway points to cross. Similarly, in the drinker paradox, there's an infinite number of small sips that must be taken, but the process seems to continue indefinitely, leaving you with the sense that you never actually achieve the goal of quenching your thirst. Philosophical implications of infinite cycles. The drinker paradox raises questions not only about the nature of infinity and recursion, but also about the human condition. The paradox can be viewed as a metaphor for the way people constantly chase goals that seem to perpetuate themselves. For example, in the pursuit of happiness or success, individuals may find that their pursuit only deepens their desire for more, creating a cycle of want and dissatisfaction. Just as drinking can never fully quench an infinite thirst, our desires may never be fully satisfied. Each achievement, each goal reached, may simply give rise to new desires, leading to a constant cycle of striving and wanting. The paradox highlights the contradiction inherent in any process that perpetuates itself, and challenges the idea of a final or completed state. As such, it can be seen as a modern exploration of ancient philosophical themes about infinity, self-referencing, and recursive systems. At first glance, the drinker paradox seems almost absurd. It's hard to imagine that the act of drinking could lead to an unending cycle. We naturally assume that if we drink enough water, we will eventually quench our thirst. However, the paradox emerges when we question this assumption and consider how drinking itself could potentially maintain or even increase the need for drinking. The paradox works like this. You are thirsty, and you begin drinking to satisfy your thirst. But as you drink, you find that your thirst seems to persist. The more you drink, the more you feel the need to drink, as though each sip creates a new desire for more water. At what point, then, can you say that you've satisfied your thirst? If the very act of drinking continually generates more thirst, then it seems impossible to ever reach a state of satisfaction. This creates a self-referential loop, where the act of drinking perpetuates the very thing it was meant to resolve. Let's break this down. The initial act of drinking. You begin the process with a clear goal, to quench your thirst. The logic is simple. If you drink, you'll feel less thirsty. This is the basic assumption we all operate under. Drinking water reduces the sensation of thirst, and eventually, if you drink enough, your thirst will be completely gone. But the paradox starts to unfold when we consider how drinking changes the situation. With each sip, your body processes the water, and this process brings about a new awareness of thirst. Even if you're physically drinking, the act of drinking is somehow linked to an endless cycle, the recursive loop. The key to the paradox is the recursive nature of thirst. As you drink, the act itself seems to create a new thirst that requires more drinking. The paradox doesn't necessarily imply that you will never quench your thirst. It simply suggests that the act of drinking and the act of thirst are so deeply connected that the resolution of one continuously creates the need for the other. The more you drink, the more you are aware of your thirst, and this awareness pulls you back into the cycle. In essence, the paradox raises the question, paradox of free choice. Imagine you are given an opportunity to make a free choice, one that could change the course of your life. You take a deep breath and feel empowered by the freedom of the decision in front of you. But then, a troubling thought creeps into your mind. Is your decision truly free? Or is it already determined by forces beyond your control? Whether it's your past experiences, genetic predispositions, or even the physical laws of the universe. This is the paradox of free choice. It asks, how can our choices be truly free if everything, from the molecules in our brain to the vast cosmic laws that govern the universe, is governed by prior causes? If everything is determined, then can we ever truly be free to choose? The paradox doesn't simply call into question the idea of free will. It probes deeper into the very nature of autonomy and the illusion of self-determination. Are we truly in control of our actions, or are we just actors playing out a script we had no hand in writing? Let's explore this paradox and see how it challenges our most basic assumptions about freedom, responsibility, and the nature of reality itself. The paradox of free choice is a philosophical dilemma that has been debated for centuries, particularly in the realms of determinism and free will. It has been explored by thinkers from ancient Greece to the present day, including prominent philosophers such as Aristotle, Immanuel Kant, David Hume, and Jean-Paul Sartre. The central question at the heart of the paradox is whether humans can make free choices, or if all actions are determined by prior causes, leaving no room for true autonomy. The debate between determinism and free will can be traced back to the early Stoic philosophers, who argued that everything in the universe is governed by divine reason or fate. According to determinism, every event in the universe is caused by a preceding event, which implies that our choices are predetermined by a chain of events extending back to the beginning of time. This leads to the idea that we are not the true authors of our actions, but rather passive participants in a universe that has already decided the course of events. However, philosophers such as Sartre and Kant rejected determinism, asserting that human beings possess the unique ability to make free choices, regardless of the forces that influence them. Sartre, in particular, championed the idea of existential freedom, where individuals are responsible for creating their own values and making choices, even in a world that may seem indifferent or hostile to human desires. Despite the centuries-long debate, the paradox of free choice continues to haunt modern philosophy, particularly in light of new discoveries in neuroscience and physics that seem to suggest the world is deterministic in nature. The paradox challenges us to reconsider the nature of free will and whether we can ever truly claim ownership of our choices. The paradox of free choice arises from the tension between two seemingly contradictory ideas: free will and determinism. On one hand, we feel that we make free choices every day, whether it's what to eat, whom to love, or what career path to follow. On the other hand, there is compelling evidence from physics, biology, and philosophy suggesting that everything, from the smallest particles to the largest events in the cosmos, is governed by a chain of causes. If everything has a cause, then can we truly be free to make our own decisions? To understand the paradox, we need to first break down the two opposing concepts: determinism and free will. Determinism is the idea that every event or state of affairs, including every human decision, is the result of preceding events or causes. This means that for every decision we make, there are a series of prior causes, whether they are biological, psychological, or environmental, that have led us to make that particular decision. In this view, if we were to know all the relevant factors, our genetic makeup, past experiences, the laws of physics, we would be able to predict exactly what decision we would make in any given situation. In this sense, free will is an illusion, because, according to determinism, our choices are not free, but are predetermined by a chain of causes beyond our control. This concept of determinism has deep roots in the natural sciences. In physics, the idea of a deterministic universe is most famously associated with Newtonian mechanics, where every particle's motion is determined by the forces acting upon it. Under this view, if we could measure the position and velocity of every particle in the universe, we could predict the future with absolute certainty. The same logic applies to human decisions. If we knew everything about a person's brain, their experiences, and the laws governing their body, we could predict their actions. However, this deterministic view of the world leads to the paradox of free choice. If everything is predetermined, then where does freedom fit in? If we have no control over our actions, if our decisions are the result of prior causes, then how can we claim to be responsible for them? Free will, on the other hand, is the idea that individuals have the ability to make choices independent of external forces or prior causes. According to free will proponents, human beings possess a unique capacity for self-determination, which allows us to choose freely between alternatives, regardless of the circumstances or prior events that may influence us. Free will is often seen as essential for moral responsibility, the idea that we can be held accountable for our actions because we are free to choose them. Many philosophers, such as Immanuel Kant, have argued that free will is a necessary condition for morality. Without free will, it would be impossible to hold anyone responsible for their actions, because they would have no control over them. Kant famously argued that moral actions are only meaningful if they arise from a free will, and that true moral agency requires the ability to choose otherwise. In addition to Kant, Jean-Paul Sartre, an existentialist philosopher, championed the idea of radical freedom. Sartre argued that we are condemned to be free, meaning that we are always responsible for our actions, regardless of external circumstances. Even in the face of external pressures or limitations, Sartre believed that we are free to choose how to respond, and thus we must bear the burden of that freedom. The core of the free will argument is that we, as individuals, experience a sense of choice. We feel that we are free to choose between alternatives, and this feeling of autonomy is central to how we experience the world. The question, however, is whether this feeling of freedom is an accurate reflection of reality, or whether it is simply an illusion. The paradox arises when we try to reconcile these two ideas, determinism and free will. If determinism is true, then every choice we make is the result of prior causes, and we are not truly free. But if we are not free to choose, then how can we be responsible for our actions? Conversely, if free will exists, then we must have the ability to make choices independent of prior causes. But how can this be possible in a world governed by deterministic laws? One way to think about the paradox is through the concept of responsibility. If our actions are predetermined by factors beyond our control, such as our genetics, upbringing, or the physical laws of nature, then how can we be held responsible for them? This raises the issue of moral responsibility. If our choices are determined, then can we truly be held accountable for them? This issue becomes particularly important when we consider issues of justice. If a criminal's actions are determined by their environment or biology, can they be punished for their actions? If we live in a deterministic world, then it seems unfair to punish someone for doing something they had no real control over. On the other hand, if we embrace the idea of free will, then it seems we must hold individuals accountable for their actions, since they could have chosen differently. In order to resolve the paradox of free choice, many philosophers have tried to reconcile determinism and free will through a concept known as compatibilism. Compatibilists argue that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive, and that it is possible for both to coexist. According to compatibilism, even if our actions are determined by prior causes, we can still be considered free as long as we are able to act in accordance with our desires and intentions. For example, a compatibilist might argue that if a person is locked in a room with no windows but chooses to sit down, their choice is still free in the sense that it aligns with their own desires. Even though the situation is determined by prior causes, e.g. the person's desire to sit, the constraints of the room, the choice is still considered free because the person could have chosen to stand up or act differently if the situation had been different. Thus, compatibilists argue that freedom is not the absence of causality, but rather the ability to act according to one's internal motivations, without external constraints. The paradox of free choice has profound implications for how we understand human behavior, morality, and the structure of reality itself. It forces us to confront the limits of our understanding of autonomy and responsibility. Are we truly free to make choices, or are our decisions the result of a complex web of deterministic causes? The paradox doesn't just affect abstract philosophical debates, it influences real-world issues of justice, responsibility, and human rights. At its core, the paradox challenges our understanding of self-determination. It raises the question, if we are determined by factors beyond our control, how can we ever truly claim to be the authors of our own lives? The paradox serves as a reminder that even our most basic assumptions about freedom and choice may be more fragile than we think, and that we must continually question what it means to be truly free. Paradox of entailment. Imagine you're trying to follow a logical argument, and at first, everything makes sense. The premises are solid and the conclusion seems inevitable. But then, something strange happens. The logic you thought you understood begins to twist and fold in on itself, and suddenly you find that the very act of making a logical inference has created a paradox. This is the essence of the paradox of entailment. It presents a situation in formal logic where an inference seems to make sense but leads to a conclusion that is paradoxical or self-contradictory. How can this be? After all, in formal logic, the rules of inference are supposed to be strict and reliable, ensuring that we can draw conclusions from given premises. Yet the paradox of entailment challenges this certainty by showing how even valid rules of inference can lead to bizarre results. It calls into question the very nature of reasoning and the reliability of our logical systems. Can we trust logic if it can lead us to paradox? Let's dive into this perplexing paradox and explore the strange world where logic itself becomes the source of contradiction. The paradox of entailment originates in the study of formal logic and is closely related to other paradoxes that arise from self-referential statements and contradictions in reasoning. In the field of philosophical logic, entailment refers to the relationship between propositions, where one proposition logically follows from another. For example, if proposition P implies proposition Q, then P entails Q, meaning that if P is true, then Q must also be true. The paradox of entailment, however, arises from the idea that sometimes logical entailment doesn't lead to a clear or consistent outcome. It shows that there are cases where valid rules of inference can lead to conclusions that seem paradoxical or contradictory. This paradox is closely tied to the study of non-classical logics that challenge the assumptions of traditional logic systems. In classical logic, we assume that inference follows a straightforward path. If a premise is true, then the conclusion that follows must also be true. This assumption, however, breaks down in some cases, particularly when we deal with self-referential statements or paradoxical premises. The paradox of entailment can be seen as a manifestation of this breakdown in logic, where following the rules of inference too rigidly can lead to contradictions. Although it is difficult to pin the paradox of entailment on a single philosopher, it arises from the works of Kurt Gödel, Bertrand Russell, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, whose investigations into the foundations of mathematics and language uncovered the limitations of formal systems. The paradox highlights the limitations of classical logic, suggesting that even well-established logical systems can break down when we encounter contradictions or paradoxical reasoning. At first glance, formal logic appears to be a reliable system. If you start with true premises and follow the rules of inference, you should arrive at a true conclusion. However, the paradox of entailment reveals that this assumption may not always hold. It illustrates that even within the framework of valid logical systems, seemingly straightforward inferences can lead to paradoxical or self-contradictory results. To understand the paradox, we first need to understand the concept of entailment in logic. In classical logic, if we say that proposition P entails proposition Q, this means that if P is true, then Q must also be true. For example, consider the following statement. Premise: if it rains, the ground will be wet. Conclusion: the ground is wet if it rains. This is a straightforward example of entailment. If the premise, it rains, is true, the conclusion, the ground is wet, logically follows. The paradox of entailment arises when this straightforward reasoning breaks down, leading to a situation where valid inferences create paradoxical outcomes. One well-known form of this paradox occurs when we apply the rule of inference to self-referential statements. Self-referential statements are those that refer to themselves, such as the statement, "This sentence is false." If the sentence is true, then it must be false, as it claims to be. But if the sentence is false, then it must be true, as it claims to be false. This creates a logical contradiction, and no consistent truth value can be assigned to the sentence. The paradox of entailment can arise when a self-referential statement is used as a premise in a logical argument. For example, consider the following premises. Premise 1. This sentence is false. Premise 2. If premise 1 is true, then I am a liar. Conclusion: I am a liar. Here, the self-referential paradox in premise 1 creates a situation where the logical entailment doesn't lead to a consistent conclusion. If the sentence is true, then it must be false, and if it's false, then it must be true. Thus, following the rules of inference doesn't lead to a clear or consistent outcome, and the paradox emerges from the application of logical entailment to self-referential statements. In classical logic, validity means that if the premises of an argument are true, the conclusion must also be true. But what happens when the premises are self-referential or contradictory? The paradox of entailment shows that the rules of inference, when applied to certain types of premises, can lead to paradoxes that break the reliability of logical systems. To see this, let's consider an argument involving a contradictory premise. Suppose we have the following statements. Premise 1. The sky is blue. Premise 2. The sky is not blue. If we try to infer a conclusion from these premises, we are faced with an immediate contradiction. The rule of entailment would suggest that from contradictory premises, any conclusion can be derived. This is known as ex falso quod libet, or from falsehood anything follows. According to classical logic, the presence of a contradiction in the premises allows us to infer any conclusion, no matter how absurd or contradictory. This is a serious problem for classical logic, as it implies that any argument with contradictory premises can lead to any conclusion, making the system unreliable. One way to address the paradox of entailment is through the development of non-classical logics that attempt to handle contradictions in a more nuanced way. In classical logic, contradictions can lead to unpredictable and paradoxical conclusions, but in non-classical logic, the idea is to limit the scope of inference to avoid such contradictions. One example is intuitionistic logic, developed by L.E.B. Brouwer, which rejects the law of the excluded middle, the principle that every proposition must be either true or false. In intuitionistic logic, a statement is only true if we have a constructive proof of its truth. This limits the types of inferences that can be made and avoids the paradoxical consequences of classical logic. Another example is paraconsistent logic, which allows for contradictions to exist in a system without causing the system to collapse. In paraconsistent logic, contradictions do not lead to the explosion of all conclusions, as they do in classical logic. This allows for a more controlled and logical handling of contradictions, making it possible to reason through paradoxes without falling into complete inconsistency. These alternative logics provide a way to handle the paradox without falling into the trap of logical absurdities. By introducing more refined rules of inference, non-classical logics prevent the paradox of entailment from undermining the entire system. The paradox of entailment forces us to rethink the reliability of formal systems of reasoning. It challenges our assumptions about logical inference and the reliability of deductive reasoning. While classical logic provides a powerful tool for drawing conclusions, it becomes unreliable when applied to self-referential or contradictory premises. This paradox has profound implications for philosophy, mathematics, and even the philosophy of language. It raises questions about the nature of truth and meaning. If logical systems can lead to paradoxes when self-referential statements are involved, how can we trust our logical systems to reliably represent reality? Are there limits to the kinds of reasoning that we can employ to understand the world? Furthermore, the paradox of entailment invites us to reconsider how we define truth and consistency in language and logic. If contradictions are possible, then the concept of logical entailment, one of the most fundamental ideas in classical logic, becomes less certain. The paradox suggests that the rules of inference may not always be as reliable as we assume, and that we must carefully consider the kinds of statements we use to build our logical systems. Paradox of the court. What if the law itself was trapped in a contradiction, one that could never be resolved? Imagine a judge who must decide whether a lawbreaker should be punished, but the very act of the trial itself creates an inherent paradox. This is the essence of the paradox of the court. a paradox that raises profound questions about legal systems, justice, and the authority of law. In this paradox, a law is enacted that says a person is guilty of a crime if they fail to comply with a judgment made by the court. But here's the twist. If the judge has already ruled that the person is guilty, and they do not appear for trial, they are guilty for not appearing. But if they are innocent, they shouldn't be punished for failing to attend the trial in the first place. The paradox of the court challenges our understanding of legal systems and asks whether justice can ever be served when laws themselves lead to contradictions. Can we trust the authority of the law when the law is caught in its own web of self-referential rules? Let's dive into this paradox and explore how the very foundation of law can unravel when it entangles itself in a paradox. The paradox is in the history of Western philosophy and is attributed to the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea. Zeno is best known for his paradoxes concerning motion and infinity, but his influence extended into the realm of legal and logical reasoning, where his paradoxes often explored self-reference and circular reasoning. The paradox of the court presents a situation in which a legal system is ensnared by its own rules, leading to an unresolvable contradiction. The paradox was famously presented in the context of a legal case involving a law student, Euthyphro, and his teacher, Socrates, who was being prosecuted for impiety in Plato's dialogues. According to the paradox, a defendant can be tried by a judge, but the law itself becomes entangled when a rule exists that stipulates a person will be punished if they do not comply with the court's ruling. The paradox suggests that, in a legal system where a judgment is already a foregone conclusion, the judge may be both powerless and responsible for enforcing justice. While Zeno's work laid the groundwork for many paradoxes involving contradictory premises, the paradox of the court has been further examined in modern legal theory, where it continues to raise questions about justice, responsibility, and the self-fulfilling nature of rules and judgments. The paradox invites us to question the authority of systems that are based on inherently contradictory structures, asking whether they can truly serve the cause of justice. The paradox of the court presents an intriguing and perplexing challenge to our understanding of legal reasoning. On the surface, the paradox involves a simple legal case, but as we examine it more closely, we uncover a contradiction that questions the very foundation of justice and law. To understand the paradox, let's break down the scenario. Imagine a judge has set a rule in place that a person is guilty of a crime if they fail to attend their court trial. This is the premise that the legal system operates under. According to this rule, if a defendant does not appear at the scheduled trial, they will automatically be found guilty. The law seems straightforward. Non-compliance with the trial leads to a guilty verdict. But the paradox emerges when we consider the situation from the defendant's perspective. Let's suppose that a defendant is accused of failing to attend their trial. However, the defendant argues that they should not be punished because they were unaware that their absence would result in a guilty verdict. If the defendant's absence automatically leads to guilt, it raises the question of whether they were properly informed about the legal consequences of their actions in the first place. The paradox lies in the fact that the very system that is supposed to ensure justice ends up entangling the defendant and the judge in an irresolvable cycle. The key contradiction in the paradox of the court emerges when we consider what happens if the defendant fails to attend the trial. According to the rule, their absence makes them guilty. But this raises a critical question. How can a defendant be guilty of failing to attend the trial when their guilt has already been determined by their absence? The paradox creates a circular relationship between the legal system, the defendant's guilt, and the trial itself. To illustrate the paradox, consider the following steps. Premise 1. The defendant must attend the trial to avoid being found guilty. Premise 2. If the defendant does not attend the trial, they will automatically be found guilty. Premise 3. However, if the defendant knows they will be found guilty if they do not attend, they will avoid attending in the first place to avoid punishment. Premise 4. This creates a situation in which the defendant is guilty for not attending, but they are guilty because they failed to attend, which is a result of the rule itself. Thus, the paradox arises because the defendant's guilt is both a precondition for the trial, since they must attend the trial to avoid guilt, and a consequence of their absence, since not attending automatically results in guilt. In other words, the law itself becomes self-referential, making it impossible for the defendant to ever escape the charge of guilt without being trapped by the very rules that define their guilt. The paradox of the court highlights the bureaucratic nature of legal systems. particularly when those systems become rigid and self-perpetuating. In traditional legal systems, laws are often created to ensure fairness and justice, but paradoxes like this one expose the fragility of a system that relies on fixed rules. The paradox invites us to question whether any system of law is truly just if the rules themselves are paradoxical and self-fulfilling. Bureaucracies, whether in government, law or business, often operate under the assumption that rules are clear-cut and that people must follow them precisely. But the paradox of the court challenges this by demonstrating how even well-meaning legal frameworks can become entangled in contradictions. In a system where the law itself dictates guilt for not participating in the trial, it becomes impossible for a person to truly escape punishment, even if they are unaware of the consequences of their actions. The paradox also raises broader philosophical questions about the nature of justice. If the law is self-referential and creates a situation where guilt is determined before the trial begins, can we still consider it just? The paradox suggests that a system of law that operates through self-referential rules may ultimately fail to achieve justice. Instead of serving the needs of individuals or upholding fairness, the system perpetuates its own existence at the expense of true resolution. Consider a modern example. A company might create a set of policies that are difficult for employees to understand, but the employees are held accountable for following these policies. If an employee is punished for violating a policy they did not fully understand, can we say the punishment is just? Similarly, in the paradox of the court, the defendant is caught in a situation where their guilt is determined by their actions, but those actions are governed by a set of rules that are themselves contradictory. The paradox asks whether justice is truly served when laws themselves cannot be applied in a way that ensures fairness. The paradox of the court also raises questions about the role of authority in legal systems. In the paradox, the judge's authority is undermined by the very rules they enforce. The judge is caught in the same cycle as the defendant. They must apply a rule that leads to a paradoxical outcome. In this sense, the paradox exposes the fragility of authority in systems where the rules are flawed. If authority is based on flawed or contradictory rules, can it be considered legitimate? The paradox suggests that authority cannot simply be exercised through the blind application of rules. It must be tempered by fairness, transparency, and an awareness of the consequences of those rules. One potential resolution to the paradox of the court comes from the idea of reformulating the legal system to ensure that laws do not create contradictions. This could involve introducing more flexibility into legal frameworks, where judgment is not automatically determined by rigid rules, but is instead based on a careful examination of circumstances. Such a reform might involve ensuring that defendants are not penalised for not attending trials if they have not been properly informed or given a fair opportunity to attend. Another resolution could involve introducing the concept of equitable remedies in legal systems. Rather than relying strictly on rules, the legal system could allow judges to exercise discretion when applying the law, ensuring that justice is served without falling into the trap of self-referential rules. Crocodile dilemma. Imagine a crocodile who has captured a child, and the crocodile makes a deal with the child's parent. If you can correctly guess whether I will return the child to you, I will set them free. At first, this seems like an interesting test of logic. The parent, trying to be clever, might say, "You will not return the child to me." But here's the twist. If the crocodile decides to set the child free, it contradicts the parent's statement, fulfilling the very prediction that would make the crocodile break its promise. If the crocodile doesn't set the child free, it fulfills the parent's prediction and maintains the paradox. The crocodile dilemma invites us to think about how we reason, make predictions, and the contradictions that arise from our knowledge of the world. It challenges us to consider the complexities of trust, commitment, and the consequences of our actions when the outcome depends on an unpredictable decision. Can we ever make a truly free choice when our actions are so tightly bound to the expectations and knowledge of others? Let's unravel this paradox and see how it plays with logic, prediction, and trust. The crocodile dilemma, also known as the crocodile, is a famous paradox from ancient philosophy that explores the interplay between knowledge, trust, and prediction. The dilemma first appeared in the works of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. The paradox was later used by Eubulides of Miletus, a contemporary of Plato, to explore the nature of paradoxical reasoning and logical puzzles. Eubulides is credited with a number of paradoxes, most notably the liar paradox, and the crocodile dilemma is often considered part of the same family of paradoxes. In its original form, the dilemma presents a situation where a crocodile steals a child and the parent is forced to make a prediction about whether the child will be returned. The paradox occurs when the parent makes a guess, and the crocodile must either honor or break that prediction, depending on whether the child is returned. The dilemma questions how we can trust predictions. Given that the actions of the crocodile seem to depend on the prediction itself, can the prediction be true if the crocodile's decision is already predetermined? The crocodile dilemma has been used in modern logic to challenge the assumptions of epistemic paradoxes, where the knowledge of a future action is entangled with the action itself. The paradox raises important questions about prediction, trust, and the nature of knowledge, which continue to have implications in both philosophy and logic. It's often seen as a thought experiment that highlights the contradictions inherent in making decisions based on uncertain or self-referential knowledge. The crocodile dilemma is a seemingly simple situation, but it quickly unfolds into a complex paradox that raises profound questions about knowledge, trust, and prediction. At the heart of the paradox is the interplay between the predictability of events and the actions of those involved. The situation involves a crocodile who has taken a child and promises to return them if the parent can predict the outcome. If the parent correctly guesses that the crocodile will return the child, the crocodile must break its word, creating a contradiction. Let's explore this paradox in greater detail. The basic setup of the crocodile dilemma is deceptively simple. A crocodile has taken a child, and the parent is given the opportunity to make a prediction. The parent must guess whether or not the crocodile will return the child. If the parent guesses correctly, the crocodile is bound by its promise to return the child, but this creates a problem. If the crocodile does return the child, the parent's prediction is fulfilled, but this results in the crocodile breaking its promise, as the parent was right. If the crocodile doesn't return the child, the parent's prediction is still correct, but the action taken by the crocodile contradicts the intent of the promise. The paradox hinges on the conflict between knowledge and action. If the parent knows the outcome of the situation before it happens, then the crocodile's action seems predetermined. The dilemma emerges because the crocodile's decision is directly tied to the prediction made by the parent, but that decision is itself contradictory. On one hand, if the parent predicts that the child will not be returned and the crocodile honors that prediction, the child will not be returned. But if the crocodile breaks the prediction by returning the child, it leads to a paradox, since the crocodile's action would have already been determined by the knowledge of the parent. This situation creates a tension between two different types of knowledge. On one hand, the parent's knowledge of the future leads them to make a prediction about the crocodile's actions. On the other hand, the crocodile's actions depend on the parent's prediction. The paradox occurs because the crocodile's actions cannot logically align with the prediction without creating a contradiction. The parent's prediction, once made, shapes the outcome, but the outcome is simultaneously determined by the prediction itself. The crocodile dilemma is a self-referential paradox. In self-referential paradoxes, the truth of the statement depends on itself, which leads to a situation where the statement cannot consistently be true or false. This is similar to the liar paradox, where a statement like, "this sentence is false," leads to a contradiction because it refers to itself. In the crocodile dilemma, the parent's prediction refers to the future action of the crocodile, and this creates a situation where the action of the crocodile is both determined by the prediction and yet contradictory to it. This self-referential nature of the paradox forces us to confront the idea of knowledge dependence. In the case of the crocodile, the parent's knowledge of the future influences the actions of the crocodile, but the crocodile's actions also influence the truth of the parent's prediction. This creates a circular relationship between knowledge, prediction, and action that cannot be resolved in a straightforward way. The crocodile dilemma also raises important questions about trust. The paradox suggests that even when we make predictions based on what seems like logical reasoning, we are still at the mercy of external forces that we cannot control. The parent's trust in their own prediction is shaken by the crocodile's ability to choose between contradicting the prediction or fulfilling it. If the crocodile fulfills the prediction, the paradox is fulfilled and the child is returned, but this action negates the power of the parent's prediction. The concept of trust becomes critical here, because the parent is forced to place trust in the crocodile's promise. But the very existence of the paradox undermines this trust. The crocodile's decision is not based on what the parent knows or predicts. It is entirely based on a self-referential loop that prevents the parent's prediction from aligning with the crocodile's action. This situation reflects the fragility of human knowledge and how it can be undermined by the very systems we create to understand the world. The crocodile dilemma raises further questions about the nature of free will and determinism. If the crocodile's action is predetermined by the prediction, does this mean that the crocodile is bound by the parent's knowledge? Or does the crocodile have the free will to act in a way that breaks the prediction? In the world of the paradox, the crocodile's decision seems both predetermined by the parent's knowledge and yet free to act in a way that contradicts the prediction. The paradox illustrates how the concept of free will can be complicated by the act of prediction. It suggests that our knowledge of the future can constrain our ability to make free choices, as we may become trapped in a cycle of self-referential predictions. If we know the outcome of a situation, can we truly act freely? Or are our actions just the result of the knowledge that shapes them? There are several ways to approach the resolution of the crocodile dilemma, although each brings its own set of challenges. One potential resolution is to argue that knowledge of the future does not necessarily dictate the actions of the present. In this view, the crocodile may still be free to make a choice independent of the parent's prediction. This perspective allows for free will within a deterministic system, suggesting that while we may know the outcome, we are still free to make choices. Another possible resolution is to view the paradox through the lens of non-classical logic, where contradictory premises do not lead to absurd conclusions. This approach would allow for the crocodile to simultaneously fulfill and break the prediction without leading to a logical inconsistency. By modifying the rules of inference or decision-making, it may be possible to navigate the paradox without falling into contradiction. Berry paradox. Imagine a world where definitions themselves become a source of confusion. You're trying to define a term, something that seems simple, like a berry, but suddenly the definition you create leads to a contradiction, and the more you try to explain it, the more convoluted it becomes. Welcome to the Berry paradox, a thought experiment that explores the limits of language, self-reference, and definition. The paradox arises when we attempt to define things in a way that is seemingly intuitive, yet the act of defining them reveals a logical flaw. Consider the definition. A berry is any object that is called a berry. This sounds harmless, right? But what happens when you try to define berry in this way, using the term itself? The paradox challenges the assumption that words and definitions can always be neatly applied to the real world, showing us that self-representation can lead to unexpected contradictions. Can you really define something by simply calling it what it is? Let's dive into this paradox and explore how the simple act of naming can expose the fragility of our logical systems and the limitations of language itself. The Berry paradox is a modern paradox that emerged from the study of mathematical logic and self-reception. It is a relatively recent addition to the family of paradoxes that challenge the foundations of language and meaning, but it has its roots in Russell's paradox and other paradoxes that arise from the limitations of set theory and formal definitions. The paradox was first formulated by the British philosopher and logician Graham Priest in the 20th century. It deals with the question of how we define terms, particularly when we attempt to define something in a self-referential way. The paradox arises from the idea that we can define a concept, such as a berry, but doing so in a circular manner, using the term to define itself, leads to a logical contradiction. In this case, a berry is defined as anything that is called a berry, but this creates confusion, because it doesn't provide a clear and consistent definition that distinguishes berries from other objects. The Berry paradox is related to self-referential paradoxes, like the liar paradox, where a statement refers to itself in a way that creates a contradiction. The paradox challenges the idea that definitions can be straightforward and unambiguous. It asks whether definitions that rely on circular reasoning can ever provide meaningful information, or whether they inevitably lead to confusion and contradiction. This has important implications for linguistic philosophy and mathematical logic, where precise definitions are crucial for understanding concepts and constructing logical systems. The Berry paradox presents a curious and perplexing challenge to our understanding of definition, language, and self-ception. At its core, the paradox arises from the attempt to define something in terms of itself, leading to a contradiction that exposes the limitations of our ability to construct clear and consistent definitions. While the paradox might seem trivial at first, after all, how complicated can defining a simple term like berry be? It reveals profound insights into how language works and how we structure our understanding of the world. Let's break down the paradox. The paradox begins with an innocent-sounding definition. A berry is any object that is called a berry. On the surface, this appears to be a reasonable definition. After all, what could be simpler than defining a term by the name it is given? But the problem emerges when we try to apply this definition more generally. The issue arises because the term berry is being defined in a circular manner. The definition of berry relies on the term berry itself, which leads to a self-referential loop. This is similar to the classic liar paradox, where a sentence like, "this sentence is false," leads to a contradiction. In the case of the berry paradox, the definition of a berry depends entirely on the term being defined, but this creates an infinite loop of uncertainty. What exactly does berry refer to if the definition relies on the term itself? The heart of the paradox lies in the issue of circular definitions. In formal logic and mathematics, a definition is supposed to provide a clear and precise explanation of what a term means. Definitions are meant to distinguish one concept from another, clarifying the boundaries of ideas so that we can reason about them in a logical way. But when we try to define something in terms of itself, like defining berry as anything that is called a berry, we run into a problem. The term becomes unbounded and indeterminate. In this sense, the berry paradox highlights an important flaw in the process of defining terms. A good definition should serve to eliminate ambiguity and provide clarity. However, when definitions rely on self-representation or circular reasoning, they undermine their own usefulness. Instead of clarifying what a term means, they create a semantic fog, where the term can be used in any context, making it impossible to distinguish between things that are berries and things that are not. For example, consider the statement, "A berry is any object that is called a berry." This statement is true by the definition itself, but what does it tell us about the nature of a berry? Nothing at all. The definition doesn't distinguish between a strawberry, a blueberry, or a rock that has been whimsically labelled a berry. In essence, the term berry loses its meaning and becomes meaningless as a result of the circular definition. The berry paradox illustrates an important lesson about logical consistency and definition. In logic, a definition is expected to be non-contradictory, meaning that it should not lead to contradictions or paradoxes. But in this case, the paradox reveals that some definitions, particularly self-referential ones, inherently lead to contradictions. This has far-reaching implications for formal logic and the philosophy of language. One of the key issues the paradox raises is the idea of indeterminacy in language. If a term can be defined in terms of itself, then it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to pin down a precise meaning for the term. This is especially problematic in the realm of mathematical logic, where precise definitions are crucial for building logical systems. If we cannot define terms in a clear, non-circular way, then our entire logical system becomes suspect. The paradox also raises questions about reference in language. What does it mean for something to refer to a concept? In this case, the definition of berry seems to rely on the act of naming itself, rather than on a clear description of the object being named. The act of labelling something a berry becomes the defining feature, which means that any object, no matter how unrelated it is to the concept of a berry, can be considered a berry simply by being called one. This reveals a flaw in our understanding of how language operates. It highlights the potential for language to become detached from the real world and descend into absurdity. The berry paradox can also be seen as related to Russell's paradox in set theory, which deals with the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. In Russell's paradox, the set of all sets that do not contain themselves leads to a contradiction, because if such a set exists, it must both contain and not contain itself. Similarly, in the berry paradox, the term berry is defined in terms of itself, which causes the definition to become ungrounded and paradoxical. This analogy highlights the broader issue of self-referential definitions in formal systems and their potential to break down. The berry paradox can be resolved by recognizing that self-referential definitions are inherently flawed. In formal logic, definitions must be clear, precise, and non-circular. To resolve the paradox, we need to redefine the term berry in a way that does not rely on the term itself. This could involve providing a more substantive definition of berry, for example, defining it as a type of fruit that meets specific biological or botanical criteria. By doing so, we avoid the trap of circular reasoning and restore meaning to the term. Another resolution might involve adopting a hierarchical approach to definitions, where terms are defined in terms of other terms, but never in terms of themselves. This would prevent circular definitions and ensure that each term has a clear and consistent meaning. In the broader context of philosophical logic, the berry paradox encourages us to be cautious when dealing with self-referential concepts. While self-referential is an important aspect of many logical systems and philosophical arguments, it can lead to contradictions and paradoxes if not handled carefully. Unexpected hanging paradox. Imagine being told by a judge, "You will be hanged at noon on one weekday next week, but the execution will be a surprise. You will not know the day of your hanging until the executioner arrives at noon that day." At first, this seems like a straightforward declaration, but it quickly becomes a riddle. The condemned prisoner, trying to deduce the day of the hanging, begins to analyze the situation logically. If the hanging happens on Friday, I will know on Thursday that it must happen on Friday, and therefore the hanging cannot occur on Friday. The same reasoning applies to Thursday, Wednesday, and so on. If the prisoner can eliminate each day based on the surprise condition, they conclude that the hanging cannot happen at all. But of course, the hanging does happen and the prisoner is surprised. This is the essence of the unexpected hanging paradox, a paradox of prediction, surprise, and self-acknowledge. The paradox reveals how our expectations and reasoning about future events can be deeply flawed, especially when those events are tied to our own knowledge and predictions. How can we be surprised by something that we think we have figured out? Let's dive into this paradox and explore how it challenges our understanding of time, prediction, and logic. The unexpected hanging paradox is a famous riddle that explores the nature of prediction, knowledge, and surprise. The paradox was first presented by Theodore R. Smith in the 20th century, although its origins are often traced back to older philosophical thought experiments that deal with paradoxical reasoning. The paradox became widely known after being referenced in several mathematical and philosophical texts, particularly those discussing paradoxes in logic and probability theory. In the story, a judge tells a condemned prisoner that they will be hanged at noon on one weekday next week, but that the hanging will be a surprise. The prisoner, trying to reason through the situation logically, concludes that it is impossible for the hanging to occur, since the surprise element would be violated by any logical deduction. However, the hanging does take place and the prisoner is surprised, which seems to defy their reasoning. The paradox has been studied extensively by philosophers, logicians, and mathematicians, especially in relation to concepts of self-reference, time, and probability. It illustrates how knowledge of future events can interfere with our ability to predict them accurately. The paradox highlights the limits of reasoning and logical prediction, and it is often used to explore how we form expectations about future events based on incomplete or self-referential information. The unexpected hanging paradox is a reflection of the complex relationship between expectation and reality, showing how even seemingly rational reasoning can lead to contradictory or paradoxical outcomes when we factor in surprise and uncertainty. At first glance, the unexpected hanging paradox seems like a mere logical trick. A prisoner is told they will be hanged on a weekday next week, but the hanging will be a surprise. The prisoner then begins to reason through the statement, eliminating each day one by one, concluding that the hanging cannot happen at all. But of course, the hanging does occur, and the prisoner is surprised. The paradox forces us to confront the limits of our reasoning and the strange relationship between knowledge, time, and surprise. Let's break this down step by step. The judge's statement sets up an intriguing puzzle. The prisoner will be hanged on one weekday next week, but the hanging will be a surprise, meaning the prisoner will not know the day of their hanging until the executioner arrives at noon that day. This creates an immediate tension between the certainty of the hanging and the uncertainty of the day. The prisoner, in an attempt to reason logically, begins by considering the days of the week. If the hanging were to occur on Friday, the prisoner reasons, I would know by Thursday that it must occur on Friday, because it would be the last possible day for the hanging. Therefore, the hanging cannot happen on Friday. Similarly, the prisoner eliminates Thursday, Wednesday, and so on, reasoning that if the hanging were to occur on any of these days, they would be able to predict it the day before. This logical process seems sound, and the prisoner concludes that the hanging cannot happen at all. because every day of the week can be eliminated based on the surprise condition. But this reasoning leads to a paradox. The hanging still occurs, and the prisoner is surprised, which contradicts their earlier conclusion. The core paradox in this riddle arises from the tension between prediction and surprise, the prisoner's reasoning about the days of the week, and the surprise condition creates a predictive loop. The prisoner assumes that the surprise element can be logically deduced, but in doing so, they predict that the hanging cannot happen at all. However, the hanging does take place, and the prisoner is surprised, which means their prediction was false. The paradox here is that the prisoner, who is attempting to predict the future, finds themselves trapped by their own reasoning. They predict that the hanging will never happen, but the very nature of the surprise contradicts their prediction. This creates a circularity. The more the prisoner tries to predict the day of the hanging, the less they are able to anticipate it, leading them to a situation where they are both certain and uncertain at the same time. The act of prediction undermines the possibility of surprise, and yet the surprise still happens. This paradox is deeply connected to ideas in epistemic logic, the study of knowledge and belief. The prisoner's knowledge of the hanging creates a feedback loop where the knowledge itself influences the outcome. The paradox suggests that our ability to predict the future is limited by the very nature of our knowledge. In some cases, knowing about an event in advance can prevent us from accurately anticipating its true nature or timing. This raises profound questions about knowledge and certainty, as well as the reliability of our reasoning. One of the most fascinating aspects of the unexpected hanging paradox is the role of surprise. The paradox hinges on the idea that surprise is inherently unpredictable. If the prisoner knows when the hanging will occur, then it would no longer be a surprise. But the prisoner's reasoning leads them to believe that the hanging cannot happen, which paradoxically sets up the very condition for surprise. The act of anticipating the surprise creates a situation where the prisoner cannot predict the outcome, even though they have made a logical attempt to do so. This concept of surprise is a reflection of how humans engage with the uncertainty of the future. The paradox challenges our assumptions about how we experience events that are supposed to be unexpected. It highlights how the very attempt to predict or control the future can interfere with our ability to experience it fully. The prisoner's reasoning shows that by trying to eliminate surprise through rational prediction, they only make the surprise more inevitable. The unexpected hanging paradox also shares similarities with self-referential paradoxes, where the outcome of a situation is determined by the knowledge or reasoning applied to it. The paradox can be seen as a form of self-fulfilling prophecy. The more the prisoner attempts to deduce the day of the hanging, the more they become trapped in a contradiction. Their own reasoning leads them to a conclusion that is both true and false. The hanging is impossible, yet it happens. In a similar way, the paradox touches on the concept of self-reference in time. By reasoning about their fate, the prisoner inadvertently interferes with their ability to experience the outcome. This is akin to other time paradox, such as the grandfather paradox, where actions in the past affect the future in contradictory ways. The paradox of time in this case is that the prisoner's knowledge of the future prevents them from understanding it, just as knowing the answer to a riddle often takes away its mystery. The unexpected hanging paradox also raises important questions about probability and knowledge. From a probabilistic perspective, the prisoner's reasoning involves eliminating each day as a possible outcome, based on their assumption that the hanging will be a surprise. However, the paradox shows that even when we try to reason logically about probabilities, we can still be caught off guard by the outcome. The paradox suggests that our knowledge of probabilities is not always sufficient to predict outcomes accurately. The paradox forces us to reconsider the relationship between rational reasoning and unpredictable events. It illustrates the limits of inductive reasoning, where we draw conclusions based on past experience, and shows how our ability to predict the future can be undermined by our own reasoning. In some cases, the more we try to predict the future, the less likely we are to anticipate what actually happens. The unexpected hanging paradox is a challenging puzzle, and while it may not have a simple resolution, several approaches can help make sense of it. One possible approach is to consider that expectation and surprise are not mutually exclusive. In this view, the paradox arises because the prisoner assumes that their reasoning can fully account for the surprise, but surprise is, by nature, resistant to prediction. The hanging still happens, not because of any flaw in the reasoning, but because surprise is an inherent part of the human experience. Another resolution might involve recognizing that the paradox speaks to the limits of predictive knowledge. The prisoner's attempt to reason through the puzzle is ultimately undermined by the fact that knowledge itself can be a barrier to understanding the future. In this sense, the paradox invites us to accept the uncertainty and complexity of the future, and to embrace the fact that not everything can be predicted, even with the best logical reasoning. Barber paradox. Imagine a small town where the barber is a very specific man. He shaves only those men who do not shave themselves. The question arises, who shaves the barber? At first, the answer seems simple. If the barber shaves himself, then by the rule he cannot. But if he does not shave himself, then by the rule he must. This creates an immediate logical contradiction. The barber both must and must not shave himself. The barber paradox, a famous riddle from the field of set theory and logic, exposes the limits of self-referential reasoning. It raises important questions about sets, categories, and the rules that govern them. The paradox makes us reconsider how we define relationships, categories, and even the fundamental assumptions of mathematics and logic. In a world governed by clear rules, how can they break down so simply? Let's dive into this paradox and explore how self-representary can lead to contradictions and confusion in logical systems. The barber paradox is a classic self-representary paradox that was introduced by the famous philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century. It is a simplified version of Russell's paradox, which is a well-known contradiction that arises in set theory, the branch of mathematics that studies sets or collections of objects. Russell's paradox shows that set theory, as originally formulated, leads to a contradiction when trying to define a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. The barber paradox is essentially a thought experiment designed to illustrate this paradox in a more accessible way. In the barber paradox, the barber is a person who shaves only those men who do not shave themselves. The logical problem arises when we try to apply this rule to the barber himself. If he shaves himself, he violates the rule that only men who do not shave themselves can be shaved by him. But if he does not shave himself, then he must be shaved by the barber, as per the rule. This creates a contradiction, as the barber cannot consistently fit into the category of men who both shave and do not shave themselves. Russell introduced this paradox as a way to show the limitations of set theory and to challenge the assumptions about how categories are defined in mathematics. The paradox helped Russell develop his theory of types, which was an attempt to resolve the contradictions that arise from self-referential definitions in formal systems. The barber paradox is deceptively simple in its setup. A barber shaves only those men who do not shave themselves. But when we try to apply this rule to the barber himself, we quickly find ourselves caught in a contradiction. The paradox is a powerful illustration of how self-referential rules, when applied too rigidly, can lead to logical inconsistencies. To understand the paradox fully, let's break it down step by step. The barber is defined by a simple rule: he shaves all men who do not shave themselves. The question that arises is, who shaves the barber? At first, this seems like a straightforward question. The answer seems to be either the barber shaves himself or someone else shaves him. However, the rule creates an immediate contradiction when we apply it to the barber himself. If the barber shaves himself, then he must fall under the category of men who do shave themselves. But by the barber's rule, he can only shave men who do not shave themselves. This creates a problem. The barber cannot shave himself if he is the one who is supposed to be shaved by the barber. On the other hand, if the barber does not shave himself, then according to the rule, he must be shaved by the barber, because the barber only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But this leads to another contradiction. If the barber is shaved by himself, then by the rule he must not shave himself, because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. In essence, the barber's rule creates a paradoxical situation in which the barber both must and must not shave himself. The paradox arises from the self-referential nature of the rule. The rule depends on whether the barber shaves himself, but the act of trying to determine this creates a contradiction. The barber paradox is a simplified version of Russell's paradox, which arises in the field of set theory, a branch of mathematics that deals with collections of objects. In set theory, a set is simply a collection of objects that satisfy a specific rule. For example, the set of all apples is the collection of all objects that are apples. But Russell showed that certain sets, when defined in a self-referential way, lead to contradictions. Russell's paradox involves the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. If such a set exists, we run into a contradiction. If the set contains itself, then by definition it must not contain itself. But if the set does not contain itself, then by definition it must contain itself. This paradox exposes the inconsistencies in the basic assumptions of set theory and challenges the idea that sets can be freely defined by any rule. The barber paradox is essentially a more intuitive version of this problem. The barber, who shaves only those who do not shave themselves, creates a situation similar to Russell's paradox. The barber's rule leads to a contradictory situation when we try to apply it to the barber himself. This paradox highlights how self-referential rules can create contradictions, making it impossible to consistently define certain categories. At the heart of the barber paradox is the concept of self-referential, the idea that a rule refers to itself. In the case of the barber, the rule that governs who is shaved by the barber also applies to the barber himself. The paradox shows how self-referential definitions can lead to contradiction. When a rule refers to the category it is part of, it becomes impossible to consistently apply that rule, because the rule creates a situation where the object of the rule, the barber, both belongs and does not belong to the category. Self-referential paradoxes are a common feature in philosophy and logic, and they often expose the limitations of formal systems. The liar paradox, where a sentence refers to itself as being false, this sentence is false, is another classic example of self-referential gone awry. These paradoxes force us to question the assumptions behind our logical systems and ask whether our rules of inference can be trusted when they involve self-referential. In mathematics, set theory is one of the most important fields affected by self-referential paradoxes. Russell's paradox showed that the concept of a set of all sets that do not contain themselves leads to a contradiction, and this was a key turning point in the development of modern logic. To avoid such contradictions, Russell proposed a solution called type theory, which restricted the kinds of sets that could be defined. The idea is that sets cannot contain themselves, and this restriction resolves the paradox. The barber paradox highlights how the act of defining a rule in terms of itself can lead to contradictions. By applying the barber's rule to himself, we fall into a loop of contradictions, unable to determine whether the barber shaves himself or not. This is a key insight into how self-referential statements can cause problems in logical reasoning. The barber paradox forces us to reconsider the nature of categories and definitions. In formal systems, definitions are meant to provide clear distinctions between objects and concepts. But self-referential definitions blur these distinctions and lead to contradictions. The paradox invites us to think about how we create and understand categories, and whether we can ever truly define something without eventually falling into self-reference. This paradox also raises questions about identity and belonging. The barber's rule creates a situation where the barber both belongs and does not belong to the category of men who are shaved by the barber. This paradox forces us to question the nature of self-identity and how we define ourselves within a system. Can we ever truly belong to a category? Or are we always at risk of falling into contradictions when we try to define ourselves? The barber paradox is also a reminder that rules and categories are not always as objective as they seem. Even simple rules about who can be shaved by the barber lead to contradictions when we try to apply them universally. This suggests that our logical systems may not always be as stable or reliable as we assume, especially when they involve self-referential or circular reasoning. The barber paradox can be resolved by restricting the kinds of definitions we allow in formal systems. Type theory, introduced by Bertrand Russell, resolves self-referential paradoxes by ensuring that sets or categories cannot contain themselves. In type theory, a set of all sets that do not contain themselves is not allowed, because such a set would lead to a contradiction. Similarly, the barber in the paradox cannot both be a member of the group of men who shave themselves and the group of men who do not shave themselves. By creating a system that distinguishes between different types of categories, type theory avoids the paradox. Another potential resolution to the paradox is to rethink the application of the barber's rule. Instead of defining the barber's role in a self-referential way, we might try to define the rule more clearly, ensuring that it applies only to those who are not the barber. This could eliminate the contradiction and allow us to consistently apply the rule. Lottery paradox. Imagine you are standing in line to buy a lottery ticket. You know the odds of winning are nearly impossible, millions to one. As you walk out of the store, you feel confident that, just like everyone else, you're unlikely to win. But now consider the following. What if you were told that exactly one person will win the lottery and they are one of the people who just bought a ticket? This is the lottery paradox. You know that one person must win, but you also know that each individual ticket holder is extremely unlikely to win. How can you simultaneously believe that with certainty you won't win, while also knowing that someone will win, including yourself? The paradox challenges our understanding of probability, belief, and certainty. If the odds of winning are so low, how can we justify believing we won't win, and yet accept that someone will inevitably win? Let's dive into this paradox and explore how it forces us to confront the limitations of our beliefs and the nature of rational decision-making. The lottery paradox has its roots in epistemic logic, the study of knowledge, belief, and reasoning. It was first explored in the early 20th century by philosophers and logicians such as Richard Jeffrey and David Lewis, who were concerned with how people form beliefs in the face of uncertainty. The paradox itself comes from the idea that, while you know the odds of winning the lottery are extremely low for each individual ticket holder, you also know that exactly one person must win. The paradox was developed as part of broader philosophical inquiries into probability theory and belief revision. How we adjust our beliefs based on new information. The lottery paradox is significant because it shows how we often rely on probabilistic reasoning to form beliefs. But this reasoning can lead to contradictions when it comes to individual belief and group certainty. For instance, each ticket holder has a belief that they won't win, yet the probability of one person winning is certain. The paradox is closely related to the problem of induction, where we form conclusions based on empirical observations, but those conclusions may not always hold true in every case. Just because something is probable does not mean it is inevitable for any given individual. The lottery paradox forces us to reconsider how we use probability and certainty in our decision-making and belief systems, as it reveals that even rational belief in low-probability events can lead to contradictions. The lottery paradox is a fascinating and perplexing challenge to our understanding of probability, belief, and certainty. It highlights how we form beliefs about the world based on uncertainty and the law of large numbers, but how these beliefs can sometimes lead to contradictions or challenges when examined more deeply. To understand the paradox fully, we must explore the tension between individual belief and collective certainty. At first, the lottery paradox seems to be a simple problem of probabilities. Imagine that you buy a lottery ticket, and you know that there are 1 million tickets in the lottery, and that only one ticket will win. The odds of winning are therefore 1 in a million, so you are highly unlikely to win. In fact, if you think about it logically, you might even believe that, given the extremely low odds, it's almost certain that you won't win. This belief is rational. If you calculate the probability of winning, it is so low that you can reasonably assume you won't be the one to win. However, now consider the broader picture. The lottery will be won by someone, and exactly one person will hold the winning ticket. There is no doubt that someone will win. It's a certainty. But if you believe, as you do, that the odds of your individual ticket winning are so low, how can you reconcile the fact that someone must win with your belief that you are unlikely to be that person? In other words, how can you hold the belief that you won't win while also knowing that one ticket holder will inevitably win? This creates a contradiction. You are certain that someone will win, but you believe, based on the odds, that you are not the person who will win. How can both of these beliefs be true simultaneously? The paradox arises from the tension between probabilistic reasoning and logical certainty. On one hand, probabilistic reasoning suggests that the chance of winning the lottery is so low that you are almost certain not to win. This is a perfectly rational belief based on the statistical odds. However, on the other hand, the certainty of the lottery's outcome, that someone will win, creates a situation where, although you are rationally convinced that you are unlikely to win, you are logically certain that someone in the group of ticket holders must win. In order to fully grasp the paradox, consider the following reasoning. Premise 1. You buy a ticket and the odds of winning are extremely low. Premise 2. Given the odds, you believe that you are highly unlikely to win. Premise 3. You also know that one person must win. This leads to a logical conflict. The paradox occurs because we are attempting to apply probability to a collective certainty. We know that one winner will emerge, but each individual ticket holder, by the rules of probability, should believe that they are highly unlikely to be that person, yet they are also part of the collective pool of winners, and one of them must be chosen. Thus, each individual ticket holder must reconcile their probabilistic belief that they won't win with the certainty that one of them will win, and this creates a paradox. The lottery paradox also touches on belief revision, the process by which we adjust our beliefs based on new information. In the context of the lottery, you revise your belief about the likelihood of winning when you understand the odds, but you are also aware that someone will win. So how can you simultaneously hold two beliefs? One that you will not win, based on the low probability, and one that you must be the winner, in some abstract sense, because the lottery will be won. This paradox questions the rationality of belief. In traditional epistemic logic, we typically believe that if an event is highly unlikely, we should adjust our belief to reflect that. But the lottery paradox challenges this by showing that, even with a strong belief in probability, we are forced to acknowledge the inevitability of the lottery's outcome. So, how do we adjust our beliefs when there is both uncertainty about an individual outcome and certainty about the collective outcome? The lottery paradox raises important questions about the interpretation of probability and how we reason about uncertain events. Frequentist probability theory, which is based on the idea that probabilities reflect long-term frequencies of events, suggests that while the chance of an individual winning is very low, the certainty of one person winning is inevitable. This creates a probabilistic tension. We know that the event will happen, but we cannot pinpoint who will experience it. The paradox challenges our understanding of probabilistic reasoning in relation to individual events. We assume that if something is highly unlikely, it will not happen to us. But in the case of the lottery, the individual probability of winning is low, yet the aggregate probability ensures that someone must win. This contradiction exposes the limits of probabilistic reasoning when it comes to events with fixed outcomes, such as the lottery. The lottery paradox highlights the tension between logical certainty and probabilistic belief. It shows how the knowledge of an inevitable outcome can conflict with the individual's belief about their personal chance of winning. In real-world decision-making, we often rely on probabilistic reasoning to guide our choices, but the paradox suggests that, in certain cases, this reasoning can lead to contradictory beliefs. For example, in game theory and decision theory, we often have to consider the probability of certain outcomes, but the lottery paradox reminds us that, even when the odds are against us, we cannot ignore the certainty of the outcome. This has profound implications for how we make decisions about uncertain events, especially when our individual beliefs conflict with the larger structure of outcomes. It suggests that rational decision-making may sometimes involve reconciling conflicting beliefs about probability and certainty. One possible resolution to the lottery paradox is to recognize that both beliefs, the rational belief that you won't win and the logical certainty that someone will win, can coexist, even if they seem contradictory. The paradox does not necessarily require us to abandon probabilistic reasoning, but rather to accept that our beliefs about individual outcomes can coexist with the broader certainty of a collective event. This duality reflects the complexity of belief systems and how they can accommodate uncertainty and certainty simultaneously. Another way to resolve the paradox is through the concept of belief revision. Rather than treating the paradox as a contradiction, we could view it as an invitation to revise our beliefs in response to new information. As the lottery progresses and the chance of winning becomes more apparent, we adjust our beliefs to reflect the evolving situation, which may help us reconcile the tension between individual probabilities and collective certainty. Raven paradox. Imagine you are walking down the street and you see a raven. Based on the hypothesis, all ravens are black, this raven confirms the theory that all ravens are indeed black. But now, consider this. You also see a white shoe, and you think, this white shoe also confirms that all ravens are black. How can a white shoe, something unrelated to ravens, confirm a theory about their colour? The raven paradox forces us to rethink what counts as evidence for or against a theory. While the sighting of a black raven clearly supports the idea that all ravens are black, the sighting of a white shoe seems counterintuitive as evidence in support of the same theory. The paradox challenges our understanding of confirmation and evidence in scientific reasoning and everyday reasoning. If unrelated observations can confirm a theory, how do we know what counts as valid evidence? Let's dive into this paradox and explore the surprising ways in which we validate knowledge and why our intuitions about evidence may sometimes be misleading. The Raven paradox, also known as Hempel's paradox, was introduced by the German philosopher Carl Gustav Hempel in the 1940s as a thought experiment in the philosophy of science. It explores the idea of confirmation theory, which deals with how evidence is used to support or disprove scientific hypotheses. Specifically, the paradox challenges the way in which we think about what constitutes evidence for a hypothesis. The paradox arises from the principle of confirmation, which states that evidence can support a hypothesis in two ways, either by confirming the hypothesis directly or by disconfirming its negation. In the case of the hypothesis all ravens are black, any observation of a black raven seems to directly confirm the theory. However, according to Hempel, an observation of a non-black object, such as a white shoe, also logically confirms the theory, because it is an observation of a non-black object that is not a raven. This creates a paradox because, while we would intuitively regard seeing a white shoe as irrelevant to the theory, confirmation theory suggests it still counts as evidence supporting the hypothesis. The paradox has been the subject of much debate in the philosophy of science and logic, with scholars questioning how we should treat evidence in scientific reasoning. Hempel's paradox demonstrates the complexities involved in scientific inference and has important implications for how we understand the role of evidence in forming beliefs about the world. The Raven paradox is a perplexing issue in confirmation theory that challenges our intuitive understanding of evidence and how it contributes to confirming or refuting a hypothesis. While it might seem like common sense that only direct observations of relevant objects, such as black ravens, count as evidence for the theory all ravens are black, the paradox suggests that even observations of irrelevant objects, such as white shoes, can be considered evidence in support of the hypothesis. To understand this paradox, we need to break down the underlying reasoning and explore the implications for scientific inference and epistemology. The Raven paradox begins with a simple hypothesis. All ravens are black. This is a universal generalization, which means it applies to every raven in existence. The hypothesis suggests that if we were to examine any raven, it would be black. Now, consider the process of testing this hypothesis. In order to confirm the hypothesis, we would look for black ravens. Each time we observe a black raven, this provides positive confirmation for the hypothesis. This is straightforward and in line with our everyday reasoning. Seeing a black raven makes the hypothesis more likely to be true. But now, according to Hempel's logic, the theory all ravens are black can also be confirmed by the absence of counterexamples. This means that any observation of a non-black object that is not a raven can also be considered evidence confirming the hypothesis. For example, if you observe a white shoe, you are not observing a raven, but you are observing something that is not a raven and is not counter to the hypothesis. Since the theory is about all ravens being black, the fact that a non-raven object is not black does not disprove the theory, and it counts as a form of confirmation. The paradox arises because this seems counterintuitive. While the sighting of a black raven makes sense as confirming evidence, the sighting of an unrelated object, like a white shoe, feels irrelevant to the hypothesis. Yet, in the logic of confirmation theory, it still counts as evidence supporting the theory, simply because it is not a counterexample to the hypothesis. The paradox forces us to confront a deeper question about how we think of confirmation in everyday life. We naturally associate confirmation with direct and relevant evidence. Seeing a black raven directly supports the hypothesis that all ravens are black. But when we extend the logic of confirmation theory to include unrelated observations, such as a white shoe, the confirmation process seems to break down. It suggests that any observation of an object that is not a counterexample to the theory can serve as a form of confirmation, which is a highly counterintuitive result. This discrepancy highlights the difference between logical reasoning in formal systems, like confirmation theory, and our intuitive sense of evidence. In scientific reasoning, it is important to distinguish between evidence that is directly relevant to a hypothesis and evidence that is irrelevant, but still consistent with the hypothesis. However, confirmation theory does not make this distinction and treats any observation that does not contradict the hypothesis as contributing to the overall confirmation. The Raven paradox has important implications for how we understand scientific inference. In science, we often make hypotheses based on observations, and then we test these hypotheses by collecting evidence. But the paradox suggests that evidence that seems irrelevant can still contribute to the overall confirmation of a theory. This raises concerns about what counts as valid evidence, and how we can be sure that we are collecting evidence that genuinely supports or refutes a hypothesis. For example, in the case of the all ravens are black hypotheses, observations of irrelevant objects like white shoes or green apples seem to provide confirmation even though they have no direct bearing on the hypothesis. This challenges our understanding of what constitutes scientific evidence and suggests that we need to be cautious about how we interpret confirmation in scientific reasoning. One possible resolution to the paradox is to recognize that confirmation in scientific inquiry is not just about counting individual pieces of evidence, but also about the relevance of that evidence to the hypothesis in question. Evidence that is directly relevant to the hypothesis, like the observation of a black raven, should be given more weight than evidence that is merely consistent with the hypothesis, like the observation of a white shoe. This distinction helps maintain the integrity of scientific inquiry, ensuring that we focus on evidence that directly pertains to the question at hand. Another implication of the raven paradox is the issue of over-confirmation. According to confirmation theory, the sighting of every non-black object that is not a raven contributes to the confirmation of the hypothesis all ravens are black. But this leads to a problem of over-confirmation, where observations that have little to do with the hypothesis are treated as evidence supporting it. This creates an inflation of evidence that may give a false sense of certainty about the theory, even though the evidence is largely irrelevant. The paradox thus raises concerns about how we quantify and evaluate evidence in scientific reasoning. If observations that are clearly unrelated to the hypothesis can still be counted as evidence, then the process of confirming a theory may become disconnected from the real-world evidence that actually supports or refutes the theory. This could lead to situations where a theory appears to be more strongly supported by evidence than it actually is. There are several ways to address the raven paradox and its implications for confirmation theory. One resolution is to refine the way we think about the relevance of evidence. Instead of counting all observations that do not contradict the hypothesis as evidence, we could focus on relevant evidence, observations that directly pertain to the hypothesis at hand. This would align more closely with our intuitive sense of evidence and ensure that we are not inflating the confirmation of a theory with irrelevant observations. Another resolution comes from Bayesian confirmation theory, which focuses on updating beliefs based on new evidence. In Bayesian theory, we assign probabilities to hypotheses and update these probabilities as we gather more evidence. This approach allows us to consider the degree of confirmation provided by each piece of evidence, ensuring that we prioritize evidence that is most likely to affect the validity of the hypothesis. Finally, some philosophers have argued that the raven paradox is less a real paradox than a problem of language. In this view, the paradox arises because we are interpreting the word confirmation too broadly. By focusing on the logical structure of the paradox, we miss the distinction between evidence that is substantive and evidence that is merely consistent with a hypothesis. To resolve the paradox, we could simply revise our understanding of what constitutes valid evidence. Ross paradox. Imagine you are in a courtroom and the judge makes a ruling based on the probability of an event occurring. Suppose the judge says, if it is highly probable that the defendant was at the scene of the crime, then they are guilty. But then the judge is presented with evidence that contradicts this, showing that the defendant was not at the scene, yet the probability of their guilt is still high due to indirect evidence. This is the essence of Ross paradox, a legal paradox that challenges the relationship between probability, causality, and legal reasoning. The paradox shows how probabilistic reasoning can lead to paradoxical outcomes when used to infer guilt or innocence in legal contexts. When probabilities are treated as determinative, we are forced to question the fairness of conclusions drawn from incomplete or indirect evidence. How do we weigh the causal relevance of evidence when it seems highly probable that the defendant is guilty, yet the evidence itself doesn't directly support the claim? Let's dive into Ross's paradox and explore how probability theory and causal reasoning intersect with the complexities of legal systems. Ross paradox was introduced by the philosopher David Ross in 1951 as part of a discussion on the application of probability theory to legal reasoning. The paradox arises from the use of probability to determine guilt in a legal case, particularly when the evidence is indirect or incomplete. Ross used this paradox to explore how probabilistic reasoning could lead to conclusions that seemed unjust or irrational, especially when used in legal decision-making. The paradox is based on the idea that when evidence is highly probable, it is often treated as definitive proof, even if the evidence itself is not direct or causally relevant. Ross's paradox demonstrates the pitfalls of using probability as the sole means of determining truth, especially when complex causal relationships or indirect evidence come into play. The paradox challenges the assumption that probability can always replace direct evidence in legal contexts. While Ross originally introduced the paradox in the context of legal philosophy, it has since been widely discussed in the philosophy of science and epistemology, where it raises important questions about the role of probability in reasoning and inference. Ross's paradox has been instrumental in highlighting the limitations of causal inference and statistical reasoning in contexts that require moral judgment or fairness. The paradox remains an important thought experiment in the ongoing debate over how we should reason about probability and causality in decision-making. The Ross's paradox presents a troubling challenge to the application of probability theory in legal reasoning. At its heart, the paradox exposes how probabilistic evidence can lead to unjust or irrational conclusions when used to infer guilt or innocence. In order to understand this paradox, we need to explore the concepts of probability, causality, and legal reasoning, and how they interact in a way that can sometimes lead to contradictory or unsatisfactory conclusions. Ross' paradox arises from a situation in which a defendant is judged based on probabilistic evidence rather than direct or causal evidence. Let's say a judge is tasked with determining whether a defendant is guilty of a crime based on circumstantial evidence. The judge is presented with evidence that makes it highly probable that the defendant was at the scene of the crime. Perhaps they were seen in the area, or there is evidence linking them to the crime. However, there is also evidence that directly contradicts this, such as alibi testimony or forensic evidence showing that the defendant could not have been at the crime scene. At first, the judge may reason that because the probability of the defendant's involvement in the crime is so high, it is reasonable to conclude that the defendant is guilty. However, this reasoning ignores the causal relevance of the evidence. Although it is probable that the defendant was at the scene, this probability is based on indirect evidence and not on the defendant's actual actions or presence at the crime scene. The paradox lies in the fact that probability is being treated as a substitute for causal evidence, even when the probability is derived from factors that are not directly linked to the defendant's guilt. The key issue in Ross's paradox is the distinction between probability and causality. In legal reasoning, evidence is often treated as either probative, i.e. supporting the hypothesis of guilt, or exculpatory, i.e. supporting the defendant's innocence. However, probabilistic reasoning treats evidence as a statistical measure of likelihood, rather than as evidence that is causally relevant to the event in question. This leads to a situation where inference based on probability can be misleading. In the case of the Ross paradox, the defendant is judged based on the probability that they were at the scene of the crime, rather than the actual causal link between the defendant and the crime. The problem with this approach is that probability does not capture the causal relationship between the defendant and the crime. For instance, a person may have been in the area where the crime occurred, but that does not necessarily mean they committed the crime. The causal inference about the defendant's involvement in the crime is weakened by the use of probability, which cannot always capture the true nature of events. Probabilistic reasoning may lead to conclusions based on indirect or circumstantial evidence that are simply more likely to be true, without taking into account the more direct, causal evidence that might prove the defendant's innocence. This is where the Ross paradox reveals a flaw in the use of probability in legal reasoning. Probability does not always equate to certainty or causality. One of the central issues in the Raven paradox is the idea that legal reasoning should be based on evidence that has a direct causal connection to the defendant's guilt or innocence. This is why we often rely on direct evidence, such as eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, or forensic analysis when making legal determinations. These forms of evidence provide a direct link between the defendant's actions and the crime, allowing for a clearer determination of guilt or innocence. However, in the case of Ross's paradox, probabilistic reasoning becomes a substitute for direct evidence. A judge might decide that, because the probability of the defendant's guilt is high based on circumstantial evidence, the defendant should be found guilty. But this decision overlooks the incomplete or indirect nature of the evidence. For example, even though the probability of the defendant being at the scene of the crime is high, there is no causal proof linking the defendant to the crime itself. The use of probability as a proxy for causal evidence leads to a judgment that might not be morally or legally justified. In the legal system, the difference between probability and causality is crucial. Causal evidence directly links the defendant to the crime, whereas probabilistic evidence provides a statistical likelihood that the defendant is involved. The Ross paradox challenges the assumption that probabilistic evidence can be treated as definitive proof of guilt, showing that it may be misleading or insufficient when used as the sole basis for legal decisions. The Ross paradox also raises important questions about moral fairness in legal decision-making. If a person is judged based on probabilistic reasoning rather than causal evidence, they may be unfairly punished due to the shortcomings of the evidence. For instance, the defendant might be highly likely to have been at the crime scene, but probability alone does not account for the possibility of alternative explanations. In cases where the evidence is probabilistic, the likelihood of guilt should not be treated as proof, and fairness demands that the legal system avoid relying solely on indirect evidence. The paradox challenges our moral intuitions about justice and fairness. It forces us to consider whether probabilistic reasoning can ever be a fair basis for a conviction. Since probability is inherently uncertain, relying on it without sufficient causal evidence may lead to the conviction of an innocent person. The Ross's paradox highlights the dangers of using probabilistic reasoning in cases where moral judgment and individual rights are at stake. It demands that we carefully consider the reliability and causal relevance of evidence before making life-altering decisions based on probability. There are several potential ways to resolve the Ross's paradox and reconcile the use of probability with causality in legal decision-making. One solution is to restrict the use of probabilistic reasoning to contexts where it is directly relevant and causally connected to the defendant's guilt. In cases where causal evidence is available, it should take precedence over probabilistic evidence. This ensures that the defendant's actions are directly linked to the crime and avoids the dangers of over-reliance on indirect evidence. Another solution is to revise the way we handle probabilistic evidence in legal contexts. Instead of using probability as a sole indicator of guilt, we could introduce a threshold of certainty that must be met before a conviction is made. For example, a judge might use probabilistic reasoning to determine whether the probability of guilt is sufficiently high, but they should require additional corroborative evidence before making a final judgment. Temperature paradox. Imagine stepping into a room on a hot summer day. You feel the heat, and it's unbearable. But when you step into a different room with air conditioning, the sensation of temperature changes drastically, and you feel the coolness. Now, imagine entering a room that is exactly the same temperature as the one you just left, but this time, the air conditioning is turned off. This time, you feel much warmer. The paradox here is the difference between objective temperature and subjective perception. Temperature as a physical measurement is constant, but our perception of it is inherently subjective and can vary drastically depending on context, relative comparisons, and even personal sensitivity. The temperature paradox forces us to confront the complexity of how we experience the world and how our senses interpret objective data. If two environments are physically identical, why does our perception of temperature change so dramatically? This paradox asks whether we can ever truly trust our senses to reflect objective reality, and challenges the notion of subjectivity versus objectivity in our everyday experiences. The temperature paradox stems from the philosophy of mind and the study of subjective experience. It explores how our perception of temperature as a sensory experience does not always align with objective physical measurements of temperature. The paradox is often discussed in the context of qualia, the subjective qualities of experience, and how our minds interpret physical phenomena in ways that are deeply influenced by context, expectation, and prior experiences. Philosophers like René Descartes and John Locke have long been interested in the distinction between objective reality and our subjective perception of that reality. Descartes, in particular, posited that our senses could deceive us, and that our perception of the world was filtered through subjective mental processes. Modern philosophers, such as Thomas Metzinger and David Chalmers, have expanded on this idea by exploring how sensory experiences, like the perception of temperature, are not direct representations of external reality, but are instead the result of cognitive processing that involves both internal representations and external stimuli. The temperature paradox raises fundamental questions about how we experience the world around us and whether our perceptions can ever be entirely trusted. It questions the reliability of sense data and asks how subjective experiences are constructed. The paradox is relevant not only to philosophy but also to fields like psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive science, where the relationship between subjective experience and objective reality is a central theme of inquiry. The temperature paradox invites us to reconsider how we experience and interpret sensory data. While temperature is often considered an objective physical measurement, our perception of it is deeply subjective and varies based on context, mental state, and individual sensitivity. To understand the paradox, we must explore how physical stimuli become subjective experiences in the mind, and why this transformation can lead to seemingly contradictory experiences. Temperature, as a physical property, is typically measured in units such as Celsius or Fahrenheit, representing objective facts about the environment. For example, if you step into a room and measure the temperature with a thermometer, it might read 75 DEGF, 24 DEGC, which represents a concrete, measurable value. However, our perception of temperature is inherently subjective. The temperature paradox arises when we realize that two people in the same room, at the same temperature, might have vastly different perceptions of warmth or coldness. One person might find the room comfortable, while another might find it uncomfortably hot or cold. This subjective variation can be influenced by a variety of factors, including previous experiences, expectations, and even psychological states. For example, a person who has just stepped out of a frigid environment might perceive a room at 75 DFF as warm, while someone who has just been in the sun may find the same temperature uncomfortably cool. This subjective experience of temperature, in contrast to the objective measurement, is at the heart of the paradox. How can temperature, which is supposed to be an objective, physical property, be experienced so differently by different people, or even by the same person in different contexts? One of the key reasons for this paradox is the role of relative comparison in our perception of temperature. Humans perceive temperature not in absolute terms, but in relative terms. If you walk into a room that is warmer than the outdoor environment, you might perceive the room as hot. However, if you've been in a sauna, the same temperature may seem mild or even cool. This relative perception is part of what leads to the paradox. The same physical temperature can feel drastically different depending on what you've experienced immediately beforehand or what you compare it to. For example, after spending time in a hot desert, a temperature of 90 DGF, 32 DCC, may feel like a relief when you step into an air-conditioned space, but in a cold climate, 90 DGF might feel sweltering. This context-dependent nature of temperature perception creates an inherent subjectivity in how we experience heat or cold. The paradox arises because we might have a clear, objective measurement of the temperature, but our perception can still differ widely, depending on our context, prior experiences, or physical condition. Another factor influencing temperature perception is the role of expectation and psychological states. Our expectations about how warm or cold we should feel can influence our sensory experience. For example, if you step into a room that you expect to be cold, but is actually at room temperature, you might still perceive it as warmer than you expect, because your body has been conditioned to expect cold. Similarly, emotional states can also affect how we perceive temperature. Someone who is feeling anxious or stressed may perceive the environment as warmer than it actually is, because their body's stress response can raise their perceived temperature. The paradox here is that perception is not a passive response to the objective environment, but is actively shaped by psychological and contextual factors. Our minds are constantly interpreting and filtering sensory information, sometimes in ways that distort our perception of objective reality. In the case of temperature, we might perceive a room as hot not because of the actual physical temperature, but because of our expectations or mental state. The physical body itself plays a crucial role in how we experience temperature. Factors like skin sensitivity, metabolic rate, and blood circulation can all influence how we perceive heat or cold. For instance, a person with poor circulation might feel colder than someone with normal circulation at the same temperature. Similarly, individuals with higher body fat might experience temperature differently from those with lower body fat due to insulation differences. Moreover, physical acclimatization can affect temperature perception. If you've spent a long time in a hot environment, your body may become acclimatized to high temperatures, meaning that you will feel more comfortable in that environment than someone who is not acclimated. On the other hand, someone who has spent a long time in a cold environment might feel a chill even at temperatures that would feel warm to others. The temperature paradox is ultimately about the difference between objective reality and subjective experience. Temperature as a physical property is clearly measurable, yet our experience of it is entirely subjective. This discrepancy is what makes the paradox so intriguing. While we know that the temperature in a room is a constant value, our individual experience of that temperature can vary significantly depending on a range of internal and external factors. The paradox challenges the assumption that our senses provide a reliable, direct link to the external world. Instead, it shows that our perceptions are deeply influenced by context, experience, and even mental state. In some ways, the temperature paradox echoes other philosophical puzzles related to perception and reality. How do we know that what we perceive as reality is the same as what others perceive? How can we trust our senses if they can be influenced by internal factors? The paradox suggests that our understanding of objective reality is always mediated by subjective experience, and that we must consider the limitations of our senses when making judgments about the world around us. The temperature paradox might be resolved by acknowledging the subjective nature of perception and distinguishing it from objective measurement. While temperature can be objectively measured with instruments like thermometers, our perception of it is always filtered through our individual experience. One resolution could be to focus on objective metrics when making decisions that rely on precise knowledge of temperature, e.g. in scientific research or engineering, while recognizing the subjective variation in temperature perception in more personal or experiential contexts. Another potential resolution is to explore how we can train or modify our perceptions of temperature through acclimatization or other methods. Just as our bodies can become more accustomed to heat or cold over time, it might be possible to train our minds to better regulate or understand our subjective experiences of temperature, leading to a more consistent alignment with the objective reality. Curry's paradox. Imagine a sentence that, if it were true, would lead to a contradiction. It starts with something seemingly innocent. If this sentence is true, then the moon is made of green cheese. Now, take that sentence and twist it just a bit. If this sentence is true, then 2 + 2 = 5. While it might seem nonsensical at first, the moment you accept that the sentence is true, you are forced to accept that 2 + 2 = 5, creating a paradox. This is the essence of Curry's paradox, a paradox that arises in certain formal logical systems when self-referential statements are allowed to exist. Curry's paradox shows how a small tweak in how we handle logical inference can lead to an explosive breakdown in consistency. What does it mean to say a sentence is true, if accepting that truth forces us into contradictions? Curry's paradox challenges the foundations of logical reasoning and self-referencing, forcing us to rethink how we use inference and truth in formal systems. Let's explore this paradox and see how seemingly innocuous statements can unravel the very fabric of logical consistency. Curry's paradox was discovered by the logician Haskell Curry in the 20th century. The paradox arose in the context of intuitionistic logic, a system of formal logic developed by L.L. Brouwer that focuses on constructive proofs. Curry's paradox shows how, within certain logical frameworks, self-referential statements can lead to contradictory conclusions. The paradox was particularly significant in the study of non-classical logic and fixed-point combinators, which deal with statements that refer to themselves in some way, like, "This sentence is false." Curry's paradox arises when we allow for certain kinds of self-referential statements, which are logically permissible in systems that do not have strong restrictions on inference. By allowing for self-referential definitions, Curry's paradox demonstrates how such systems can quickly lead to explosive contradictions, undermining the consistency of the entire logical framework. Curry's work is closely related to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that no formal system can be both complete and consistent if it is sufficiently powerful to model arithmetic. The paradox is widely discussed in the context of philosophy of logic, mathematical logic, and computational theory, as it highlights the potential dangers of self-rection in logical reasoning. It also raises fundamental questions about the limits of formal systems and truth, suggesting that some systems, when pushed too far, can unravel themselves through the very structures they rely on. The Curry's paradox is a self-referential paradox that occurs in certain logical systems, and it sheds light on the limits of formal reasoning. The paradox shows how a small tweak in how we handle logical inference and truth can lead to profound contradiction. Curry's paradox challenges our understanding of truth and inference in formal systems, suggesting that under certain conditions, accepting the truth of a sentence can lead us into a logical collapse. Let's break down the paradox and explore how it operates. The paradox begins with a self-referential sentence. If this sentence is true, then 2 plus 2 equals 5. On the surface, this seems like a nonsensical statement. It combines a trivial mathematical fact, 2 plus 2 equals 4, with an absurd conclusion, 2 plus 2 equals 5, which makes the sentence seem clearly false. But here's the trick. If we accept that the sentence is true, then we are forced to accept that the conclusion, 2 plus 2 equals 5, must also be true, because the structure of the sentence operates on the assumption that if the sentence is true, its conclusion must follow. The paradox arises because we have created a sentence that, when accepted as true, leads to a false conclusion. This type of reasoning leads us into a logical collapse, where truth itself is no longer reliable. By assuming the truth of the sentence, we inadvertently undermine the system of reasoning that allowed us to establish the truth in the first place. This creates a situation where truth and falsity are entangled, leading to contradictions. At the heart of Curry's paradox is the use of self-rexadation, a feature common to many paradoxes in philosophy and logic. In this case, the sentence, if this sentence is true, then 2 plus 2 equals 5, refers to itself in a way that makes its truth conditional upon the truth of the conclusion. If we assume the sentence is true, then we are forced to accept the conclusion, regardless of how nonsensical or false the conclusion might seem. This form of self-resignation is dangerous because it creates a feedback loop in reasoning, where accepting the truth of one part of the sentence forces us to accept something else as true, even when that thing contradicts the very foundation of reasoning. The paradox shows how self-referential statements can short-circuit logical inference and create contradictions in what should otherwise be a consistent system of reasoning. This is similar to other famous self-referential paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, where a statement refers to itself as being false. This sentence is false. The liar paradox leads to a contradiction because the statement cannot consistently be either true or false. Similarly, Curry's paradox shows how self-referential statements can lead to a breakdown in logical consistency, as truth and falsity become tangled in a way that cannot be resolved. The core of the Curry's paradox lies in the concept of logical inference. In formal systems, logical inference allows us to derive new truths from established premises using rules of inference. However, Curry's paradox shows how unrestricted inference can lead to contradictions. If we allow self-referential statements to be part of our system, then we are no longer working within a system that is both consistent and complete. Instead, we enter a realm where any statement can be inferred from a true self-referential premise, leading to an explosion of contradictions. In standard classical logic, we rely on certain principles, such as modular inference and the law of the excluded middle, to maintain consistency. But when we allow for statements like, if this sentence is true, then 2 plus 2 equals 5, we bypass these logical safeguards, leading to the collapse of the system. This is the essence of Curry's paradox. It shows how even a small logical change, allowing self-referential sentences, can cause the entire system to fall apart. Curry's paradox is closely related to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which assert that in any formal system powerful enough to model arithmetic, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven within the system. Gödel's work showed that self-referential statements could lead to paradoxes and contradictions in formal systems. Similarly, Curry's paradox demonstrates that the inclusion of self-referential sentences within a formal system can create contradictions that are impossible to resolve, even though the system may seem consistent at first. Both Curry's paradox and Gödel's incompleteness theorems highlight the limits of formal systems. Formal logic, when taken too far, can lead to contradictions that undermine the very foundation of reasoning. This has profound implications, not only for mathematics, but also for philosophy, epistemology, and the philosophy of language. Curry's paradox is an important thought experiment in the philosophy of logic because it challenges the notion that logical systems can be universally and unconditionally reliable. The paradox forces us to rethink the way we build logical systems, especially when dealing with self-referential structures. It also raises important questions about truth, inference, and the limits of reason. In philosophy, logical paradoxes like Curry's force us to confront the fragility of the systems we rely on to reason about the world. If self-referential statements can lead to contradictions, how can we be sure that our logical systems are consistent in other areas? The paradox also challenges us to reconsider the assumptions underlying truth. Is truth something that can be inferred from any valid system, or is it inherently contingent on the structure of the system itself? The paradox also serves as a warning for formal systems and computational logic. In fields like artificial intelligence and computational theory, where formal reasoning is central, Curry's paradox shows that introducing self-referential constructs into a system can lead to unexpected and undesirable outcomes. It is a cautionary tale for any system that relies on logical reasoning to draw conclusions. One way to resolve Curry's paradox is to impose restrictions on the rules of inference within the system. By disallowing self-referential statements or limiting the scope of inference, we can avoid the logical collapse that arises from the paradox. This is similar to the way type theory was developed to prevent paradoxes like Russell's paradox, which also stemmed from self-referential reasoning in set theory. Another possible resolution is to redefine the concept of truth within formal systems. Instead of treating truth as something that can be derived from any logically valid system, we might adopt a more context-sensitive or hierarchical view of truth that acknowledges the limitations of formal inference in certain cases. In computational systems, restrictions on recursion or the introduction of guardrails around self-referential functions could help prevent Curry's paradox from arising in practice. Epimenides' paradox. Imagine a statement that causes a deep paradox simply by its very nature. In a small village, the philosopher Epimenides says, "All Cretans are liars." This seems straightforward enough, but here's the catch. Epimenides himself is a Cretan. So, if his statement is true, that all Cretans are liars, then he himself must be lying since he's a Cretan. But if he's lying, then his statement, "all Cretans are liars," must be false, which means not all Cretans are liars, implying that Epimenides is telling the truth. This creates a logical loop, where the statement cannot consistently be true or false. This is the Epimenides paradox, or the liar paradox, which is one of the oldest and most famous paradoxes in philosophy. The paradox challenges our understanding of truth and self-reference, raising important questions about the nature of language, logic, and reasoning. How can a statement be both true and false at the same time? Let's explore this paradox and discover the profound insights it offers into language, truth, and the limitations of logical systems. The Epimenides paradox, also known as the liar paradox, was first introduced by the ancient Greek philosopher Epimenides of Crete around 600 BCE. Epimenides, who was a Cretan himself, famously declared, "All Cretans are liars." This seemingly simple statement led to one of the earliest known paradoxes in the history of philosophy. The paradox arises because Epimenides, as a Cretan, is part of the very group he is describing. If we accept his statement as true, then as a Cretan, Epimenides must be a liar, which means that his statement cannot be true. But if his statement is false, then not all Cretans are liars, which means that his statement could be true. This creates a self-referential loop in which the statement cannot consistently be classified as either true or false. The Epimenides paradox has become foundational in the study of logic and semantics, particularly in the field of self-referential and paradoxes of truth. It is closely related to other paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, which appears in various forms throughout history and has influenced the development of formal logic, set theory, and the philosophy of language. The paradox remains a key point of study in the exploration of truth and reference in both philosophy and mathematical logic. The Epimenides paradox is one of the most intriguing and well-known self-referential paradoxes. At its core, the paradox challenges our understanding of truth and logical consistency. The paradox is simple in its structure but has profound implications for our approach to reasoning, self-references, and the foundations of logic. To fully grasp the Epimenides paradox, we need to break it down step by step and explore the implications it has for truth and logical systems. The paradox begins with the statement, "All Cretans are liars," made by Epimenides, the Cretan himself. The statement seems straightforward. It asserts that all members of the Cretan group lie. However, the paradox arises when we examine the implications of this statement. If we accept the statement as true, then Epimenides, being a Cretan, must also be a liar. If he is a liar, then his statement, "All Cretans are liars," must be false. But if the statement is false, it means that not all Cretans are liars, which contradicts the original statement. On the other hand, if we reject the statement and assume it is false, then not all Cretans are liars. But if Epimenides' statement is false, then it suggests that there are Cretans who tell the truth, which could mean that Epimenides himself, as a Cretan, could be telling the truth. This would mean the statement, "all Cretans are liars," is indeed true. Thus, the Epimenides paradox creates a logical loop in which the statement cannot be consistently classified as either true or false. The paradox exposes the limitations of self-referential reasoning and reveals how certain kinds of statements can undermine our ability to reason coherently. At the heart of the Epimenides paradox is the concept of self-referential. A self-referential statement is one that refers to itself, either directly or indirectly. In this case, Epimenides' statement refers to the truth of his own statement. If he is telling the truth, then all Cretans are liars. But if he is lying, then his statement is false. This creates a circular relationship between the statement's truth and its falsity. Self-referential statements are inherently problematic in formal logic because they create contradiction. The liar paradox, a broader version of the Epimenides paradox, operates on the same principle of self-referencing. In the liar paradox, a statement like "this sentence is false" leads to a contradiction because if the sentence is true, it must be false, and if it is false, it must be true. This paradox shows that self-referencing can break the consistency of logical systems, making it difficult to determine the truth or falsity of statements that refer to themselves. The Epimenides paradox illustrates the fragility of our logical systems when they include self-referential statements. This paradox is a precursor to later developments in mathematical logic, such as Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that certain formal systems are inherently incomplete and cannot prove all truths within their own framework. The Epimenides paradox also raises important questions about the nature of truth and belief. In everyday reasoning, we tend to believe that a statement is either true or false. This is known as the law of the excluded middle, which states that for any proposition, either the proposition is true or its negation is true. However, self-referential paradoxes, like the Epimenides paradox, show that this law does not always hold when dealing with statements that reference themselves. In the case of the Epimenides paradox, the statement cannot be categorized as simply true or false, because accepting either outcome leads to a contradiction. The paradox challenges our traditional understanding of truth. Is truth something that is absolute and binary, or is it something that can be influenced by context, interpretation, and self-representing? The Epimenides paradox suggests that truth may not be as straightforward as we often assume, especially when dealing with complex, self-referential statements. Furthermore, the paradox also highlights the issue of belief. If we are confronted with a paradoxical statement like, "all Cretans are liars," how should we adjust our beliefs? Should we hold the statement as true, even if it leads to a contradiction? Or should we reject it entirely? The paradox forces us to reconsider how we handle statements that seem to defy our usual understanding of truth and logic. It asks whether belief systems can withstand the complexity of self-referential reasoning, or whether they must be revised in order to accommodate these paradoxes. The Epimenides paradox has profound implications for the structure and consistency of formal logical systems. In formal logic, consistency is a key property. A system is considered consistent if it does not allow both a statement and its negation to be true at the same time. However, the Epimenides paradox shows that self-referential statements can create logical contradictions, making it impossible to maintain consistency within the system. This paradox is an early example of how self-referential constructs can undermine logical systems. It helped lay the groundwork for Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which showed that formal mathematical systems that are sufficiently powerful, like set theory, can be both incomplete and inconsistent. In these systems, there are always true statements that cannot be proven within the system, and there are statements that can lead to contradictions if taken too far. The Epimenides paradox also highlights the limitations of deductive reasoning, the process of drawing conclusions based on logical rules. If self-referential statements can lead to contradictions, then deductive reasoning may not always be reliable when dealing with statements that refer to themselves. This forces us to reconsider the foundations of mathematical logic and philosophical reasoning, acknowledging that some forms of self-referential may be fundamentally undecidable or inconsistent. The Epimenides paradox also raises questions about the relationship between language and truth. Language is inherently a system of symbols and signs that we use to represent ideas about the world, but when a statement refers to itself, like all Cretans are liars, it begins to stretch the boundaries of meaning and reference. This self-representation can cause ambiguity in how we interpret the statement, leading to contradictions and logical breakdowns. In the case of the Epimenides paradox, the language itself creates the paradox, suggesting that truth and meaning are not always fixed, but are dependent on context and the way language is used. This has profound implications for philosophy of language, suggesting that meaning is not always clear-cut, and that statements can sometimes refer to themselves in ways that make it impossible to determine their truth value. One possible way to resolve the Epimenides paradox is to restrict the use of self-referential statements in formal systems. By avoiding self-referential, we can ensure that statements do not create contradiction. This approach has been adopted in systems like type theory, which avoids self-referential sets to prevent paradoxes like Russell's paradox and the Epimenides paradox from arising. Another solution might involve hierarchical structures in reasoning, where statements that refer to themselves are placed in separate levels to prevent them from collapsing into contradictions. By separating self-referential statements from other forms of reasoning, we can preserve consistency and avoid paradoxical outcomes. Relling-Nelson paradox. What if a word could describe itself in one context but contradict itself in another? Imagine we create a new word, heterological, to describe words that do not describe themselves. For example, the word small is heterological because it doesn't describe itself. It isn't a small word. Now consider the opposite, autological, a word that describes itself, like short, for a short word, or English for the English language. Here comes the paradox. Is the word heterological itself heterological, or is it autological? If it's heterological, then it describes itself, which means it should be autological. But if it's autological, then it doesn't describe itself, meaning it should be heterological. This is the Relling-Nelson paradox, a mind-bending paradox that emerges from the way we categorize words and their relationships to themselves. It forces us to ask, can words be used to describe themselves without falling into a contradiction? Let's explore this paradox and delve into the complexities of language, self-reference, and categorization. The Relling-Nelson paradox was first introduced by the German logicians Kurt Grelling and Oscar Nelson in 1930. It arose as a problem in formal semantics and the study of self-requisite within the structure of language. The paradox stems from the attempt to categorize words as either autological or heterological, and the logical contradiction that arises when we try to apply these categories to certain words, like heterological itself. The paradox highlights a deeper issue in philosophical logic and linguistics. How do we categorize language in a way that avoids self-contradiction? Especially when a word is used to describe itself. The autological category refers to words that describe themselves, like English or short. On the other hand, heterological refers to words that do not describe themselves, like long, since the word long is not itself long. However, when the term heterological is applied to itself, the contradiction arises. It cannot consistently fit into either category without leading to a paradox. The Relling-Nelson paradox is similar in nature to other well-known self-referential paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, that challenge our understanding of language, meaning, and logic. By addressing the limits of categorization, this paradox underscores the complexity of linguistic reasoning and the difficulties inherent in applying logical structures to language. The Relling-Nelson paradox is a striking example of how self-differentiation and language intersect in complex and contradictory ways. It challenges the boundaries of language categorization, forcing us to examine how we define and apply terms in ways that can lead to logical contradictions. The paradox is rooted in the idea of categorizing words as either autological or heterological, based on whether they describe themselves. To understand the paradox fully, we need to break down the definition of these categories and explore how applying them to the term heterological itself leads to an irresolvable contradiction. In the Relling-Nelson paradox, we begin with two basic categories for words. Autological words. These are words that describe themselves. For example, short is an autological word because it is indeed short in length. Similarly, English is an autological word because it is the name of the English language. Heterological words. These are words that do not describe themselves. An example of this is the word long. Long is not a long word, so it is heterological. In the same way, the word small is heterological because it is not a small word. So far, The concept of categorizing words as autological or heterological seems straightforward. We categorize words based on whether they describe their own properties. But here's the catch. We now need to apply this categorization system to the word heterological itself, which leads to the paradox. Let's consider the word heterological. According to the definition, it is a word that does not describe itself. It is a heterological word because it does not describe the property of being a heterological word. So by this reasoning, the word heterological should be heterological, meaning it does not describe itself. However, this creates a problem. If the word heterological is heterological, then it does not describe itself. But we now encounter the following contradiction. If heterological is heterological, then it must not describe itself. But that would imply that the word heterological is describing itself as not describing itself, which means it is describing itself after all. This contradiction leads to the paradox. The paradox arises from a self-referential loop that is triggered when we try to categorize heterological. When we try to categorize the word heterological as either autological or heterological, we encounter a logical loop. If heterological is heterological, then it cannot describe itself. But if it cannot describe itself, it must be autological, and if it is autological, it must describe itself. The inability to assign heterological definitively to one category or the other results in a contradiction. This paradox shares similarities with other self-referential paradoxes in logic, such as the liar paradox, where a sentence refers to itself and creates a contradiction. In the liar paradox, the statement, "this sentence is false," creates a similar logical problem. If the sentence is true, it must be false, and if it is false, it must be true. Likewise, the Grelling-Nelson paradox reveals how self-representation in language can lead to irreconcilable contradictions, forcing us to question the validity of categorizing language in this way. The Grelling-Nelson paradox has significant implications for the philosophy of language and the logic of categorization. The paradox exposes the limitations of applying rigid categories to language, particularly when the language itself refers to its own properties. By showing that certain terms cannot be consistently classified, the paradox challenges the idea that all language can be categorized into clear, non-contradictory categories. This has important consequences for linguistic philosophy, where categorization is central to understanding meaning. The Grelling-Nelson paradox suggests that our linguistic systems may not always be as precise and consistent as we assume. When we try to categorize words based on properties such as self-reflection, we are forced to confront the inherent limitations of language. The paradox forces us to ask whether language is inherently inconsistent, or whether we need more flexible, context-dependent systems for categorizing terms. The paradox also raises questions about formal logic and the philosophy of semantics. In formal logic, systems are designed to avoid contradictions by strictly defining how terms can be used and how inferences can be made. The Grelling-Nelson paradox shows that even within formal systems, there are limits to categorization when it comes to self-referential terms. The paradox forces us to reconsider how we treat self-referential language in formal logic. Self-referential tool in both mathematics and language, but it can also lead to logical collapse, as we see in this paradox. For formal logic to work, we must either restrict the use of self-referential terms or reinterpret them in a way that avoids contradictions. The Grelling-Nelson paradox illustrates that without proper safeguards, logical systems can be undermined by self-referential constructs, and that careful thought must be given to how language and reasoning interact. One way to resolve the Grelling-Nelson paradox is to adopt a more flexible approach to categorization, where terms like heterological and autological are understood not as fixed categories, but as context-dependent classifications. Instead of treating these categories as binary, we could interpret them as gradual or situational, recognizing that some words might fit into both categories depending on the context. Another resolution might involve limiting self-recognition in formal logic systems, similar to how other paradoxes, like Russell's paradox, are dealt with by restricting the types of sets that can be defined. By controlling the use of self-referential terms, we can avoid the contradictions that arise from statements like, "all Cretans are liars," or the Grelling-Nelson paradox. Hilbert Bernay's paradox. Imagine you're in a world of mathematical systems, where all the rules are well-defined and logical steps seem to work flawlessly. But what if one simple rule, seemingly harmless, undermines the entire system? The Hilbert-Bernays paradox shows us how logical inference can break down when a formal system is forced to accept too many rules. The paradox revolves around the provability of statements in formal systems, specifically focusing on how self-referential statements and infinite chains of reasoning can cause contradictions. In a world where every step is carefully constructed and every rule meticulously followed, the paradox reveals that even logical systems can collapse under their own weight, forcing us to confront the limitations of formal reasoning. What happens when the rules themselves become inconsistent or incomplete? The Hilbert-Bernays paradox challenges our assumptions about the reliability of formal logic and shows how certain self-referential constructs can unravel the very fabric of logical systems. Let's explore this paradox and uncover how infinite regress and self-referentiation can affect even the most rigorous mathematical structures. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox is named after David Hilbert and Hans Bernays, two prominent 20th century mathematicians who contributed to the development of formal logic and mathematical foundations. The paradox arose in the context of formal systems, specifically those that attempt to prove or disprove the consistency of certain statements. Hilbert and Bernays were involved in the pursuit of a complete and consistent set of axioms for mathematics, a project that ultimately led to Gödel's incompleteness theorems. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox deals with the limitations of formal systems and how logical inference can become problematic when systems are too self-referential or complex. It arises from the fact that, in certain formal systems, there are statements that can be provable and unprovable at the same time, leading to a situation where the system's internal rules break down. The paradox highlights the fact that infinite regress or self-referential constructs can undermine the consistency of a system, revealing the incompleteness of formal systems in some cases. While not as famous as Gödel's incompleteness theorems, the Hilbert-Bernays paradox contributes significantly to the study of mathematical logic and foundationalism by showing that even well-defined systems of logic can have limitations. The paradox has been influential in exploring the boundaries of proof theory and the inherent limitations of formal systems. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox exposes an inherent flaw in formal logical systems, particularly when it comes to provability and self-referential reasoning. To understand this paradox, we must first explore the nature of formal systems, the role of logical inference, and how self-referential statements can lead to inconsistencies. This paradox demonstrates that even in rigorous systems of logic, contradictions can arise, showing the limitations of formal reasoning. A formal system is a set of rules and axioms used to generate statements and proofs. These systems are designed to be consistent, no conclusions, and complete, able to prove every truth within the system. A formal system operates on a set of axioms, which are basic, self-evident truths, and uses rules of inference to derive conclusions. The system is assumed to be self-contained, meaning that everything we need to prove a statement is already contained within the system's axioms and rules. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox arises from the limitations of these formal systems, specifically when we apply the concept of provability. In formal systems, a statement is said to be provable if it can be derived using the axioms and rules of inference within the system. However, the paradox shows that there are certain types of statements that, under certain conditions, cannot be proven or disproven within the system. This is a key element of Gödel's incompleteness theorems. One of the key features of the Hilbert-Bernays paradox is the role of self-referencing in formal systems. The paradox arises when a system allows for self-referential statements that refer to themselves, such as, "This statement cannot be proven." These types of statements create a problem because they invoke a loop of reasoning that cannot be resolved within the system itself. In essence, the system is forced to reason about its own limitations, which leads to inconsistency. In the case of the Hilbert-Bernays paradox, we consider a statement like, "This statement cannot be proven within the system." If the statement is true, then it cannot be proven because it asserts its own unprovability. But if the statement is false, then it must be provable, meaning that the system must be able to prove it, which creates a contradiction. This paradox is a direct consequence of the self-referential nature of the statement and exposes the incompleteness of the formal system. A formal system that allows such self-referential statements will eventually be unable to maintain logical consistency. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox shows that self-referential reasoning cannot be fully contained within formal systems. and that allowing such statements leads to an infinite regress of reasoning, where the system cannot determine whether a statement is provable or not. This forces us to reconsider the foundational assumptions of formal systems and their ability to provide consistent truth. At the heart of the Hilbert-Bernays paradox is the study of proof theory, a branch of mathematical logic that deals with the formalization of mathematical proofs. Proof theory aims to understand the structure of proofs and the conditions under which a proof can be derived from a set of axioms. The paradox arises when we examine the relationship between provability and truth. In formal systems, we typically assume that if something is true, it can be proven within the system, but the Hilbert-Bernays paradox challenges this assumption by showing that there are true statements that cannot be proven within a system. This contradiction becomes clear when we consider statements that are self-referential, such as, "This statement cannot be proven." In this case, the truth of the statement and its provability are inextricably linked, but the system cannot determine which is correct, leading to a breakdown in consistency. The paradox highlights a central theme in proof theory, the distinction between provable truth and unprovable truth. In formal systems, a statement that cannot be proven within the system is said to be undecidable. The paradox demonstrates that when self-referential statements are allowed in a formal system, they can lead to situations where the system cannot determine whether certain statements are true or false, thus revealing the inherent limitations of the system. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox is deeply related to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which state that any formal system that is powerful enough to model arithmetic is either incomplete or inconsistent. Gödel showed that within such systems, there are true statements that cannot be proven within the system, and there are statements whose truth cannot be determined at all. This directly ties into the Hilbert-Bernays paradox, as both illustrate the limitations of formal systems in dealing with self-referential or undecidable statements. In fact, Gödel's first incompleteness theorem states that in any consistent formal system that is capable of expressing elementary arithmetic, there are true statements that cannot be proven within the system. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox essentially demonstrates this same principle in a more intuitive way. By introducing self-referential statements into a system, we force the system to deal with statements that can neither be proven nor disproven, creating a logical breakdown. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox has profound implications for computational theory and the design of formal systems. It reveals that infinite regress and self-referential reasoning are inevitable consequences when we allow systems to reason about their own limitations. This has significant consequences for fields like artificial intelligence and automated reasoning, where formal systems are often used to derive conclusions or verify proofs. In computational logic, systems like the lambda calculus or Turing machines must be designed to avoid paradoxes like the Hilbert-Bernays paradox, as they rely on logical inference to operate. The paradox suggests that there are limits to the power of formal systems in reasoning tasks, especially when those systems are tasked with reasoning about themselves. Just as Gödel's incompleteness theorems showed the limits of formal systems in mathematics, the Hilbert-Bernays paradox shows the limits of logical inference in computational systems. One possible way to resolve the Hilbert-Bernays paradox is to restrict the use of self-referential statements in formal systems. By disallowing such statements, we prevent the system from entering the logical loop that causes the paradox. This approach has been used in the development of type theory and other formal systems that avoid self-referential to maintain logical consistency. Another approach is to introduce hierarchical structures in formal reasoning, where certain types of statements, particularly self-referential ones, are placed at different levels of reasoning. This would allow the system to maintain consistency and avoid the collapse caused by self-referential reasoning. Noah paradox. Imagine a world where you know something is true, but you can't prove it, and the moment you attempt to prove it, you invalidate your knowledge. Enter the Noah paradox, which dives deep into the intersection of knowledge, belief, and proof. In this paradox, a person knows a statement is true, but cannot prove it in a formal way without undermining their knowledge. For example, suppose there is a person who knows this statement is true. However, if they can prove the statement using logical steps, it changes the status of their knowledge. Once a statement is provable, it shifts from the realm of personal knowledge to publicly accessible truth, and they no longer know it in the same way. The Noah paradox challenges our understanding of epistemology, the theory of knowledge, by presenting a scenario where knowledge itself becomes a self-referential trap. It pushes us to question, if knowledge must be provable, does this undermine its very nature? Let's explore this paradox and unpack the complex relationship between proof, knowledge, and certainty. The Noah paradox is rooted in epistemic logic, the branch of logic that studies knowledge and belief. It is a modern paradox primarily discussed in philosophical and logical contexts, and it is closely related to the works of philosophers and logicians concerned with the nature of knowledge and how it interacts with formal systems of logic. This paradox arose as an extension of earlier discussions on self-referential paradoxes such as the liar paradox. The Noah paradox specifically addresses the tension between knowledge and proof within formal systems. It challenges the assumption that if something is true, it must be provable, a concept at the heart of classical epistemology. The paradox is often framed as a statement like, "I know that this statement is true," but once you try to prove it within the system of logic, you move from personal knowledge to a formal truth. In doing so, the very nature of personal knowledge is compromised because proof transforms it from a subjective belief into a logical truth that is accessible to everyone. Philosophers like Saul Kripke, Richard Montague, and Michael Dummett have all explored the issues surrounding the Noah paradox as it relates to knowledge and logical systems, examining the limitations of formalizing knowledge in a way that respects both subjective experience and objective proof. The paradox forces us to consider the limits of formal reasoning and whether knowledge can truly be captured in formal systems without losing its subjective essence. The Noah paradox challenges our traditional understanding of knowledge by exploring the tension between personal knowledge and formal proof. In this paradox, knowledge about a statement like "this statement is true" becomes entangled with the act of trying to prove it, which leads to a logical contradiction. To fully understand the paradox, let's break it down on the relationship between knowledge, proof, and epistemic logic. The Noah paradox involves a statement that a person knows to be true, but once the person attempts to prove it, their knowledge shifts from subjective knowledge to objective truth. For example, consider the sentence, "I know this statement is true." At first glance, this statement is true. In a personal sense, the person knows it to be true. However, the moment the person tries to prove it formally, the situation changes. Once they prove the statement, it is no longer merely something they know, but something that is provable and publicly accessible. The paradox comes from the fact that the act of proving the statement transforms it from personal knowledge into a universally accessible truth. The person's personal knowledge becomes objective in the process of proving it. The statement that "I know this is true in a personal sense, but by proving it, the knowledge shifts and it's no longer personal knowledge in the way the person originally understood it. Thus, the paradox arises because the person's ability to prove the statement undermines their personal knowledge. This seems counterintuitive because knowledge, by definition, should involve both certainty and accessibility. Yet in this paradox, proving the knowledge changes the very nature of that knowledge. The core issue of the Noah paradox lies in the distinction between knowledge and proof. Traditionally, in epistemology, knowledge is thought of as justified true belief. In this view, a person knows something if they believe it to be true, have evidence for it, and if it is in fact true. However, the Noah paradox complicates this understanding by introducing formal systems and the distinction between subjective knowledge and objective proof. In formal logic, a proof is an objective demonstration that a statement is true. Proofs are built on axioms and rules of inference, and they are designed to be universally accessible and verifiable. This stands in contrast to personal knowledge, which is subjective. It is based on an individual's experience and internal justification. The Noah paradox shows that when we try to prove a statement that we know to be true, we strip away the personal aspect of that knowledge. Knowledge becomes a matter of formal truth rather than subjective belief. For example, a person may know that 2 + 2 = 4, but once they prove it mathematically, the personal knowledge shifts to something that is universally accessible, verifiable, and no longer tied to their individual experience. This creates a logical conflict, because proof and knowledge are often treated as distinct in formal systems. Proof transforms personal knowledge into objective truth, leaving us questioning whether knowledge can remain personal if it is provable. Can we truly know something if it can be universally proven? This is the heart of the Noah paradox. The Noah paradox shares similarities with other self-referential paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, where a statement refers to itself in a way that creates a contradiction. In the case of the Noah paradox, the statement, "I know this is true," refers to the knowledge of the statement itself. The paradox arises because the act of proving the statement makes it no longer a personal matter. Once proven, it becomes objective, accessible to anyone. This self-referential structure is what creates the paradox. By knowing the statement is true, the person establishes a relationship with the statement that is subjective. But once they prove the statement, they remove that subjectivity, rendering the statement an objective truth. Thus, the self-referential loop makes it impossible for knowledge to remain in its original form. This challenges our traditional understanding of knowledge as something that belongs to an individual and remains subjective. The paradox exposes the inherent tension in epistemic logic between the subjective nature of knowledge and the objective nature of proof. If knowledge is inherently tied to an individual's experience, how can that knowledge withstand the process of proof, which aims to make it objective and universally accessible? Another layer of the Noah paradox is the potential for infinite regress. In order for the person to prove that they know something, they must rely on other knowledge, leading to an infinite chain of justification. For example, in order to prove "I know this statement is true," the person would have to prove that they know something else, and so on, leading to an endless chain of proofs. This problem of infinite regress is closely related to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that no formal system can be both complete and consistent. Similarly, the Noah paradox reveals that in order to justify knowledge, we may need an infinite number of preceding proofs, which undermines the very idea of justified true belief. The paradox exposes the limits of formal systems in capturing the nature of knowledge and highlights the difficulties of creating a logical system that accounts for personal knowledge without devolving into infinite regress. One possible resolution to the Noah paradox is to distinguish between contextual knowledge and formal proof. Personal knowledge is inherently context-dependent and subjective. It is tied to individual experiences, perceptions, and beliefs. Formal proof, on the other hand, is objective and operates within a set of rules and axioms that can be universally verified. By recognizing that subjective knowledge cannot be fully captured by objective, formal systems, we can preserve the idea that personal knowledge is valid, even when it cannot be proven in a formal sense. This allows for the coexistence of personal knowledge and formal proof without requiring them to collapse into each other. Another approach is to consider the limits of formal reasoning. Just as Gödel's theorems suggest that some truths are unprovable within certain formal systems, the Noah paradox suggests that knowledge itself may not always fit neatly into the categories of provability and truth.